you apprised of any Matt Hour updates?
Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions.
Who are we talking about?
We are talking about John Garamundi.
All right. I thought it was Rodney. Okay, I'm good.
No, Rodney's on the committee. I know sometimes it doesn't seem that way. We don't need to take a vote on Rodney. Okay. Okay. So ordered. Today, the Aviation Subcommittee is holding its first hearing in the 115th Congress solely dedicated to the topic of unmanned aircraft systems, UAS. This hearing will consider technological, legal, and policy issues related to UAS. For new members of the committee, it will provide an overview of this very important topic. For returning members, this hearing will be an update on these issues. UAS, or drones, are a game-changing technology. While drones have been in existence for decades, they are now creating new industries and transforming others, such as agriculture. The sheer volume of UAS now operating in the national airspace system, about 2 million, have been sold in the United States to date, and their unique features are causing policymakers and operators to rethink all aspects of airspace use. Until recently, we thought of aircraft as mainly flying miles above us, carrying people and cargo between airports with runways. UAS, on the other hand, can take off and land literally anywhere. They fly a few hundred feet above the ground and easily operate around buildings, factories, utility lines, and farm fields. The possibilities are exciting. Our power companies can evaluate damage quickly after a storm while keeping people out of harm's way. Farmers can more efficiently assess their crops. All kinds of equipment and buildings can be inspected faster and safer than ever before. And drones are changing the way first responders conduct research operations and how they monitor disaster and activities. In other countries, companies are beginning to use drones to deliver goods, and either directly or in combination with delivery vans. For example, Mercedes-Benz is using drones in Switzerland to deliver items such as ground coffee and cell phone in Switzerland on a trial basis. These examples make clear how important it is to maintain American leadership in aviation. We cannot rest on our laurels. The benefits of technological advancement and the cost of complacency are too great. As such, we must continue to diligently move forward with UAS integration. But like with anything else, there are risks for which we must be mindful. As we learned earlier this year, in September over New York, a U.S. Army helicopter collided with an illegally operated drone, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage to that aircraft. In Canada, not long after, a drone struck an airliner as it prepared to land. We're lucky. No one was hurt or killed in those incidents, but we cannot count on luck to keep us safe the next time around. Yesterday, the FAA made public the results of research on collisions between UAS and manned aircraft. So far, the research shows that UAS can cause more severe damage to an airplane than a comparably sized bird. That is concerning. We will monitor the future of this research closely as they investigate the risks of ingestion of UAS into jet engines. These incidents, the numerous sightings of drones, and the research reveal that a lot of work remains to be done to achieve safe and successful integration of UAS. The witnesses on our panels today represent those who are pushing the boundaries of aviation technology and innovation. Only hard work and close collaboration between the government, industry, aviation, labor, and Congress will allow the safe integration of UAS into the national airspace system. I note that some of that hard work and collaborative effort is taking place at the FAA's Technical Center in my district. The Tech Center plays an important part in the partnership between government and industry. I look forward to hearing from our panel today about how Congress can enable the continued integration of UAS while meeting the safety challenges as they arise. Before I recognize Ranking Member Larson for his remarks, I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing for the record, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. And without objection, so ordered. And I also ask unanimous consent that a written statement prepared by the Airline Pilots Association International be entered into the record. So without objection, so ordered. And now I'd like to yield to Mr. Larson. Rick, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding today's hearing on unmanned aircraft systems integration and their emerging uses. The subcommittee held a hearing earlier this year where we discussed the FAA's readiness for new airspace users and technologies and the promise those technologies hold for our aviation system and our economy. Chairman Lobiando and I have ensured UAS have been a focus of this subcommittee's oversight work in recent years, and our work will not slow down anytime soon as the UAS proliferate into U.S. airspace. Mr. Chairman, as I was late in getting to the hearing, I'm not going to read my entire statement. I'm now just going to apologize for being late, ask unanimous consent my entire statement be into the record, and beg for your forgiveness.
There might be an objection to that. No, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Schuster.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiando, and thank you and Ranking Member Larson for holding this hearing today. The United States is a world leader in aviation. We are also a world leader in innovation, and one of the sectors that I want to see thrive is the use of unmanned aerial systems. UAS are the latest intersection of aviation and innovation, and I'm excited to see where this industry goes from here. UASs have emerged as a strong growth sector in the aviation industry and are providing good-paying jobs here in the United States. As their numbers grow and more promising applications for UAS are being realized and planned. UAS have a variety of uses ranging from assisting farmers surveying crops, crop lands, to visual inspection of aircraft, railroads, pipelines, and bridges. During the historic hurricane season we had this year, UAS has played an important role in relief and the recovery efforts. They were used as airborne cell phone towers to ensure the continued phone service and Wi-Fi internet access after these natural disasters occurred. Without this technology, many survivors of the hurricanes would have been cut off from their families. UASs were used to survey damage from the storms, allowing for faster recovery efforts. They are now being used for routine inspection of infrastructure, a function that cannot necessarily be matched by manned aircraft and often dangerous for human beings. We are seeing industry and government work closely together toward the common goal of UAS integration and keeping the United States ahead of the rest of the world in developing integration of this new aviation technology. And that's very promising. When you see collaboration occur between the private sector and government, I believe this will move us forward faster and in a safer, rather than seeing these technologies being developed overseas. So I look forward to today's hearing and from the witnesses we have here today on the current state of U.S.'s international airspace and the emerging uses of those being developed, and what we in Congress can do to address those policy issues related to the use and integration of UASs. So with that, thank Chairman Lobiando, and I yield back.
Now I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this hearing. This is critical. The commercial application of drones has incredible promise of benefits across a multitude of disciplines and applications if it's well regulated. Now, what I mean by well regulated is that it's safe, but secondly, also that we are not overly and obsessively over a long period of time prescriptive to the point where we lose the lead. In fact, we already are losing the lead in this industry. So, that's a cautionary tale that has to be weighed very carefully. Yes, absolutely safe. The biggest problem so far has been with idiots who have toy drones. Like the one in New York that are being operated illegally. And for the life of me, why we allow any toy drone to be sold without geofencing that isn't easily hackable in this country is extraordinary to me. I guess it's the pressure of the toy industry or something. So we have to get this. We have to get this straight. I asked quite some time ago for the FAA to. I said, "What happens when a drone hits a plane, or we ingest one into an engine?" Good question. Well, they've been grinding away at this very, very slowly. But yesterday we got the work product of the first part of this study, and it turns out that they can be worse than birds. A small one. In fact, they found a failure of horizontal stabilizers in an impact with a little crappy quadcopter or something like that, because they're a dense mass versus a bird, which kind of when it hits. So this is an accident waiting to happen. We are going to lose an aircraft, whether it's going to be a smaller aircraft or a larger aircraft. We have to be sure that those who are operating these things illegally are dealt with. And there's technology out there to detect these things, detect where the operators are. We need to pursue that. The FAA is working very slowly on that issue, too. We need to be able to ground these things. We're not worried about their rights as people who are operating something illegally. We've had forest firefighting in the West suspended because of these same kinds of people. We need to find them, prosecute them, and after we put a few of them in prison for a while, then that'll go away. The commercial application should not be held back because we got these irresponsible people out there. The commercial needs to be well regulated, as I said earlier. Finally, and to the FAA, and hopefully they can address this, my critical concern beyond now that, well, that's pretty bad, level 4 damage, which is the worst for horizontal stabilizers, but an engine. We don't know. And why can't we do the engine? Engines are really expensive. Well, how about we get an old surplus engine? Well, the manufacturers don't want to donate one because then they'll say, well, it was a GE engine that failed that ingested a quadcopter, but maybe a Rolls-Royce wouldn't fail. I mean, all the turbines are quite similar. Maybe we go out and get an old Aleutian engine that nobody, the point is, it's a turbofan. I think they're all going to pretty much fail the same way. And they're putting that off for another 2 years because of all these concerns. We need to know what's going to happen when one of these things gets sucked into a turbofan. And we don't. But we already know that they can cause potentially a catastrophic damage to airframes. So, we've got to move ahead, and this committee should be, I appreciate the fact we put in one of the extensions, a $20,000 fine, but, we haven't put in place the technology to find these people as they're operating them, track them down, and actually prosecute some of them. And I think maybe we got to go beyond a $20,000 fine. This is very, very serious and life-threatening, potentially. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Look forward to hearing from the experts here.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio, and we thank our witnesses for being here today. Our first panel, we have Dr. Juan Alfonso, a professor of aeronautics and astronautics, Mr. William Billy Ball, Executive Vice President and Chief Transmission Officer of Southern Company, Mr. William Goodwin, General Counsel for AirMap, and Brian Wynn, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. I'd like to remind all of our witnesses to please limit their opening remarks to no more than 5 minutes. We'll enter your remarks into the record if they go beyond that. We'll now hear from our first panel. Dr. Alfonso, you're recognized.
Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee.
Can you pull your mic a little closer, please?
Surely. First of all, thank you for the invitation to appear before you and discuss my thoughts, opinions, and ideas to ensure that the United States remains the worldwide leader in unmanned aircraft systems R&D, operations, and integration. Even though I'm a professor in the Aeronautics and Astronautics Department at Stanford University and a current member of the FAA Drone Advisory Council, I'm actually appearing before you in a personal capacity and speaking only for myself. There are many technical obstacles that prevent more widespread development and integration of UASs in the United States. But I will not focus on those technical challenges today. In fact, I would like to talk about 3 areas of the regulatory environment that can further enhance capabilities and attempt to solve the policy technology dilemmas that this field is currently facing. First, during these early days of the development of UAS capabilities, and we are in the early days, we will need more flight testing experiences, not fewer. We must try our ideas, fail, try again, succeed, because this is the iterative nature of the technology development process. The FAA UAS test sites, the Pathfinder programs, and the recently announced UAS integration pilot programs are all steps in the right direction that must be enhanced and significantly enlarged. Second, it is critical that all these tests result in data of sufficient quality in the appropriate amount so they can be used to inform the regulations and requirements that are to come. It is critical that this data be made openly available to the community for better insights and understanding. And third, we must set a regulatory environment that provides a reasonable expectation of periodic and timely updates to the levels of service available to UAS operators for those who can demonstrate compliance with stricter requirements to ensure safe operations. The United States has been at the forefront of R&D of the very capabilities that are enabling such a bright future for UASs, but the rest of the world is not sitting in the sidelines. Multiple countries have already recognized the potential civilian and military applications of drone technologies. And this situation truly begs the following questions. First, what must the U.S. do to retain leadership in the field that we had originally developed? Secondly, how do we make sure that the situation in the United States encourages both U.S. and foreign companies to test and develop here and not abroad? How do we set up the proper regulatory environment so that companies can plan ahead for both the testing, development, and deployment of their UAS systems? And last but not least, and above all, how do we ensure that the jobs that are created by this new field actually stay here in the U.S. and not go abroad? On these three areas, I'd like to begin the discussion by simply offering the following thoughts. Let me start with the topic of regulation. I think we need to ensure that we embark on a yearly cycle of updates to the existing rules. Part 107 is a wonderful starting point, and it provides a certain level of service with a minimum level of requirements to guarantee safety. But we need to do operations over people, beyond visual line of sight, at night, in proximity or close proximity to buildings and infrastructure. And all of these are logical regulatory steps that need to be tackled, and to its credit, the FAA has begun to go down this path. We need to understand what are the minimum requirements that enable these new levels of service. We need more testing, not less. This testing is needed to collect the data to inform the regulatory process. Because of the fundamental importance of safety, without the data, the regulatory process is doomed to unnecessarily burden future drone operators. UAS test programs should be significantly enhanced. As we establish new UAS flight test programs, we must require that the operators share all the data about all the flights, and we must commit to ensuring that the data, appropriately de-identified, are open to the U.S. community at large, because you must remember that the value is not in the data itself, but rather in the interpretation of the patterns and the value of that data that can be enhanced by participation of others. The only way to do this is to use a probabilistic risk-based analysis approach that uses data to understand safety. I'll finish my comments by saying that although I'm talking about mostly small UASs in my testimony today, I would like to note that similar requirements for a regulatory framework and data collection are important for larger vehicles. In the place of the country where I'm from, we're developing electric VTOL aircraft that could revolutionize personnel transportation in urban areas, and they can benefit from similar initiatives. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Ball, you're recognized.
Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Billy Ball, and I am an Executive Vice President and Chief Transmission Officer at the Southern Company. Southern provides electricity and natural gas to 9 million customers through our 11 utility subsidiaries. We operate nearly 200,000 miles of transmission and distribution lines and more than 80,000 miles of natural gas pipeline. Southern Company believes in leveraging innovation to keep energy safe, reliable, secure, and affordable. We were among the earliest energy industry adopters of unmanned aircraft systems, also known as drones. Now, for many years, as long as I can remember, we have used helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft for the regular inspection of our assets. Drones are a critical part of our future strategy for these inspections. Today, however, manned aircraft often remain more effective because of regulatory constraints on drone usage. Inspections with manned aircraft can be challenging due to low-altitude flight near towers and wires. Sadly, I have experienced this firsthand when we lost a seasoned pilot and an inspector in a helicopter crash. Being able to displace the use of manned aircraft with drones to inspect our facilities will reduce safety risks to our employees. Now, I know this committee is particularly interested in disaster response and recovery. We work alongside first responders to restore service quickly and as safely as possible. Now, though still a relatively new technology, drones already have become an important part of disaster recovery. Human-based flights have to wait until the weather is acceptable to fly, but we can get drones up quicker and begin the assessment sooner. A good damage assessment is the foundation to an effective recovery. So in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey earlier this year, Southern Company, our company, was able to provide mutual assistance to CenterPoint Energy in the Houston area by providing 6 UAS teams. We've never done this before. They were able to make multiple flights in areas no longer accessible because of all the flooding. With fewer regulatory restrictions, we believe additional flights would have been possible. After that, we utilized 16 drone teams in our own response to Hurricane Irma, which caused widespread outages for us in the state of Georgia. From our learnings in Texas, we pre-coordinated with the Georgia Emergency Management Authority, or agency, which enabled us to have improved access to make more flights. The use of drones really did improve our damage assessment. Lessons learned during both of these recovery efforts is now being shared across the utility industry and is being used to improve our efforts going forward. This spirit of collaboration within the electric power industry sets us apart from many other businesses. So with that in mind, as Congress and the FAA continue to work on these issues, we ask that you would involve electric companies when you have pilot projects, task forces, advisory committees, and the like. Without further loosening of in the regulatory space, drones will not see their full potential. Imagine inspecting transmission lines by the miles instead of only as far as you can see, which is what we're limited to today. The technology exists. The improvements in safety and efficiency are overwhelming. Other places in the world are already doing it. We want to work with FAA to get projects like this green-lighted, get them moving on. In closing, I urge you to continue to pursue policy that allows for the safe integration of UAS into the national airspace. Of particular importance, we call on FAA to finish the guidance and rulemakings called for in the 2016 FAA bill, and work with end users like our company and other utilities to use Part 107 waivers to advance drone technology. Thank you again for the opportunity for me to be here, and thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. Mr. Goodwin, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Lobiando, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. My name is Bill Goodwin. I'm the General Counsel of AirMap, the world's leading airspace management platform for drones, and we're currently deploying unmanned traffic management, or UTM, solutions that currently help millions of drones fly safely. However, to realize the full economic benefit and efficiencies that drones can provide, we have to continue to challenge our own assumptions about airspace and airspace management. We've seen enormous leadership in that regard in recent months within the administration, with the FAA and DOT, including the presenters that we'll hear on the next panel, Dan Elwell and Earl Lawrence. Internationally, however, there are countries competing with the United States, as we've heard, to integrate drones into their airspace more quickly. And other countries' openness to experimentation has now accelerated into regulatory action and standard setting that threatens to leave American businesses behind. We really have no choice but to work harder and faster to safely integrate drones into the U.S. airspace. In my testimony today, I wanted to provide a few examples of how the U.S. airspace is evolving to accommodate drones, some of AirMap's experiences in other countries that are accelerating drone integration today, and suggest some recommendations for U.S. policy to build on the recent progress that we've seen here. So in the U.S., just within the last month, the FAA certified AirMap as one of two original providers of the Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability, otherwise known as LAANC, which enables operators to get instant authorization to fly in restricted airspace. This took a 90-day process with an uncertain outcome, often leading to a rejection, and turned it into instant access for safe commercial operations. We perceive LAANC as a building block to a full UTM network, and we know that the FAA intends to roll out LAANC across the national airspace in 2018. Also in the U.S., as we've heard from other members on the panel already, AirMap technology has assisted in the response to Hurricanes Harvey and Irma just this fall. In the aftermath of each hurricane, AirMap supported vital hurricane response efforts by providing local emergency operations centers with a dashboard that allowed incident commanders to see flights and missions that were being planned and operated by operators performing search and rescue missions, and then communicate with them. Another example of some domestic innovation that we've seen is our partnership with the state of Kansas, which is a leader in aerospace innovation. We've worked closely with the Kansas Department of Transportation to deploy and develop UTM technology across the state, again with the goal of speeding the integration of drones safely and accelerating productive commercial uses of drones. But perhaps the most exciting development that we've seen here is the UAS integration pilot program announced by President Trump and implemented by the FAA on November 2nd, which we expect to open the floodgates to expanded drone operations. By leveraging the unique insights of state, local, and tribal governments, the UAS integration pilot program will create numerous laboratories of innovation and drive commercial drone activity here. Now, notwithstanding these innovations that I've highlighted, there are other countries, as I noted, that are working hard to integrate drones at a faster rate. And in some cases, they're succeeding. So today, AirMap is working with other international partners to deliver UTM solutions next year in 2018 that we fear may take the United States until 2021 or later to achieve without congressional action. So I'll just highlight a few of those in the time that I have remaining. In a joint venture with Rakuten, Japan's largest e-commerce company, AirMap is providing airspace management capabilities today to enable expanded drone operations in both suburban and exurban environments. Another noteworthy demonstration occurred in September of 2017 when we participated in Switzerland in a demonstration of USpace, which is the European equivalent of UTM. This particular demonstration is worth calling out because multiple missions were occurring simultaneously over Lake Geneva in some of the most sensitive airspace in Switzerland, and the result of the demonstration and the deployment of the technology there is persistent, approved, beyond line-of-sight commercial operations that we heard a reference to earlier today. So given our experiences here and overseas, there are three things that we think Congress can do to accelerate the safe integration of drones into the airspace in the U.S. First, Congress should expedite and prioritize the establishment of an operational UTM system by 2020. Second, Congress should apply support and resources to the FAA's drone pilot program and direct the FAA to exercise its authority to waive regulations that currently stand in the way of expanded operations. And third, Congress should ensure that a remote identification system based on licensed spectrum is established to enable nationwide expanded drone operations. Thank you again for convening this hearing to discuss the opportunities for drones here and abroad. And I'd like to finish my remarks by thanking Chairman Lobiondo in particular for his commitment to the FAA and its employees. We know that your steady hand has helped guide the agency, and in particular the FAA Tech Center, and we wish you the best of luck in your next chapter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Nguyen, you're recognized.
Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this hearing this morning. Speaking on behalf of the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, the world's largest nonprofit organization devoted exclusively to advancing the unmanned systems and robotics community. For years, AUVSI has been urging the FAA to use all available means to establish a regulatory framework for UAS. Now we have initial regulations governing civil and commercial UAS operations in the form of the Small UAS Rule, also known as Part 107. Much has been accomplished so far because government and industry have banded together to advance UAS. But I think my colleagues from the FAA would agree with me that there's still a great deal of work that needs to be done. The continued adoption of this technology will require an expanded regulatory framework that incorporates rules for, among other things, nighttime operations, flight over people, for example. We were expecting a notice of proposed rulemaking for flights over people a year ago, but this next regulatory step has been indefinitely delayed over security concerns. In trying to get this rulemaking back on track, industry stepped up and offered solutions for remote identification of UAS platforms. We expect the recommendations of the Remote ID ARC to be public soon, and industry looks forward to doing its part to implement a remote ID system that identifies any UAS flying in the airspace in real time. We hope this measure alleviates the concerns of the security community. To the extent more needs to be done, we need broader engagement from our government partners, notably those responsible for national security, to understand their specific concerns and work collaboratively to address them. Fundamental to remote identification, AUVSI has long supported a registration system for commercial and recreational UAS operators. We are glad Congress recently restored UAS registration for recreational operators. However, this piecemeal approach to solving issues regarding both commercial and recreational operators may slow progress and hinder efforts to move the industry forward. It may therefore be necessary for Congress to reevaluate the role of Section 336, the special rule for model aircraft that was part of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2012, to address security concerns and streamline the process for future regulations, such as those governing remote identification standards. The United States benefits from the safest airspace system in the world. This is largely thanks to uniform federal aviation safety and operational regulations. Maintaining consistent regulations keeps our skies safe and helps foster innovation. This authority resides and must continue to reside with the FAA. AUVSI also recognizes the need for non-federal bodies such as states, municipalities, and tribal governments to play a role in developing that federal framework. The White House's recent announcement of a UAS integration pilot program is a positive step for that effort. This pilot program represents an opportunity for state, local, and tribal governments to collaborate with the UAS industry and the FAA to further develop a federal framework for integrating UAS into the skies above communities across the nation. Of course, the UAS industry is not relying on the FAA and government alone to advance this technology. Industry currently shoulders many of the research and development costs to spur innovation, find solutions to make UAS fly higher and farther, more safely and efficiently. Industry has partnered with government to advance UAS traffic management concepts, beginning with the low-altitude authorization and notification capability, also known as LANCE, which Mr. Goodwin just referenced. Continuing collaboration will be necessary as we work toward additional UAS-related airspace management tools and further UAS integration efforts to include platforms above the small UAS threshold and for higher altitudes. Before I conclude, I want to thank Congressman Lobiando, Chairman Lobiando, who has recently announced that he would retire at the end of his term. The chairman was one of the earliest champions of unmanned aircraft systems on Capitol Hill and in his district in southern New Jersey, which has become an important center for UAS research and development. We look forward to working with Chairman Lobiando and the rest of this subcommittee in the coming year on a long-term FAA reauthorization measure that will move the UAS industry forward and spur economic and job growth for the nation. Thank you again for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wynn. Now I'll turn to Mr. Schuster for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiando. My question deals with Mr. Wynn. You hit right on at the remote identification of UASs. It seems to me that the big part of this solution, the safety, security to law enforcement, is us being able to tell who's flying those systems in the airspace up there. And so, in your view, what are the obstacles for us to get to a point where that we are able to know who's flying them? Because again, as we see these sightings and close events or near events and actual collisions that are occurring, again, knowing who's up there, be able to protect that airspace when it comes around, especially around airports or high density aviation areas. What's the obstacles? Who opposes moving forward with a some sort of remote identification?
I'm not aware of anyone that opposes it, sir, and that's a great question. We of course, to get to the holy grail of this industry's potential, which is being able to fly beyond visual line of sight, as the gentleman from Southern Company mentioned. So to continue, we're all in favor of that. We knew that we would, as commercial operators, we would have to be identifying ourselves. I think it's extremely important, particularly in urban areas, that local law enforcement have the tools in real time, as I mentioned, to be able to do that. The good news is that increasingly public safety, as we've already mentioned, is embracing this technology, and the more they use it as an everyday tool, the more they'll be able to spot an unsafe operation or something worse. So remote identification is key. Backing up one step from there was registration. So we need all aircraft registered and the ability to remotely identify. That might be a layered system, et cetera, but we're working on it.
Why do you think we haven't been able to get to that point? I guess that's going to be a question, too, that I asked the folks from the FAA. Why haven't we been able to get to that? It's because, again, to me, it seems like it's, if people are, today, we pretty much know who's flying around up there. We can identify who's flying up there. So why hasn't it been, why hasn't the rulemaking been put in place at this point? Because we've been dealing with this now for 4, 5, several years now.
Fair question, sir. I think it's been elevated in priorities. It was on the list of things that we had to get to. But I think because we've had people flying in the wrong places and there's a greater need for accountability, we pushed forward with registration, and now we have the ability, once again, for everybody to be registered. We need to push forward with this as well. If you think about most drones as flying cell phones, identification is not a difficult thing to get done. So I think we'll get it done soon.
And do you think this is one of the 1, 2, 3 most important pieces of,
yes, I do.
Of the solution?
I absolutely do.
And Dr. Alfonso, maybe you could address that in your thoughts on studying this.
Yeah, I think it's been well said. I think the lack of regulation for remote identification is just a typical case of the technology changing very rapidly. Are we going to do it through cell phone towers? Are we going to use the work of some startup companies that are developing ADS-B capabilities? Are we going to go in other means of doing this? I think the FAA is probably trying to see what is developing before they issue a regulation as to what drones must have. But it's a technically solvable problem.
Well, if we continue to do that, Mr. Goodwin, if the FAA keeps waiting to see about technology changes every couple of months probably, or at least every year. Is that accurate in your view?
I think there's room to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I do think that ultimately, with existing technology, a lot of these problems can be solved. So I agree with Mr. Wynn in that regard, that I don't think we have to wait for the perfect technological solution.
And Mr. Ball, as an operator in the airspace, do you see the technology changing that route? How many years, you said you were one of the earliest users of UASs. How quickly have you seen that technology change over the past several years?
Well, you know, for us, there's certainly the technology has been improving every year, and for us, we're a very compliance-minded company. So whatever the rules are, we just need clarity. Right. We will gladly comply. And I think you're asking a great question. I also agree. I don't think you have to wait for the perfect solution to move ahead.
And that would go towards what Dr. Alfonso said about make a rule, yes, and then every year review it to make sure that the technology hasn't grown past it or so. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate the testimony. Yield back.
Mr. DeFazio.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'd just like to follow up on that again. As I expressed at the beginning, responsible commercial operation is not the major concern. We just have to figure out, what that endeavor is. But can anybody on this panel, since you have some expertise, why should we allow toy drones to be sold that don't have geofence software in them that prohibits any illegal operation? Anybody got a clue as to why we haven't done that? Do you think maybe the FAA doesn't think they have the authority, or we would need to give them specific authority? I mean, this is a major concern for me. Anybody got an idea? I mean, is it technologically possible to do that to a toy drone? program it so it can't go into restricted airspace?
It is possible, sir. I think it's really more of a cost question than anything else. The more capable drones generally are geofenced.
Right. So then people for these little junky drones would have to pay more for them so that they won't ultimately get ingested into a jet engine because they wanted to fly it near an airport.
Well, we had that debate when we were working with the FAA on the registration process. What level do we call a toy?
Yeah.
Because it literally could be a threat. And it's very difficult.
Well, a toy is what, you know, there's a difference between a commercial operator and a hobbyist, and then, of course, we have the model airplane people who are, you know, have a long tradition of operating responsibly and within the law. But now we're incorporating to be, what, 1 million of these things sold this Christmas or more. Who knows? And, you know, there's all we're going to do is we're going to register them. That's a step forward. But what would it take to put you know, remote sensing technology on those so we would be able to track them?
Well, I think, not to be too fine on it, but I think if you mentioned the AMA, which is a great partner of AUVSI and the FAA in our Know Before You Fly campaign, which is our educational effort to try and keep people from flying where they shouldn't be.
Right.
If everyone flew that was a hobbyist was flying according to AMA rules,
Right.
they wouldn't need to geofence.
Right, but when you go to 1 million people who just got one under the tree and go, wow, look at this, I'm going to take it out and try it, they don't know.
Yes, sir.
So, but what would it take to put remote sensing technology on those things?
I'd like to answer that question for the record if I could, sir, because I think there's a cost equation that needs to get captured with that.
Right. Okay, I'm not quite getting what I want here, but okay, how about the whole idea of the FAA? I mean, sometimes the FAA gets way too prescriptive. Couldn't we just have, in terms of developing a system for, you know, so we can have remote identification for a UTM network, couldn't it be basically not prescriptive, but results-oriented? I mean, it doesn't have to be, it has to be interoperable, obviously, but it doesn't have to be one particular prescribed technology. Is that correct? And I mean, we've got the technology today. It would work today. Yeah, maybe there'll be something, you know, more compact in the future or whatever, or different, but it would still be the same thing. We just want to be able to see it and track it. Isn't that, Dr. Alonso? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're describing are performance-oriented regulations, where you describe what you mean to achieve, but you not just impose the means by which you're going to achieve them. So this is doable. On your previous question of geofencing, it's a fairly easy technology. In fact, many drones already have this, but may not be activated at a particular moment. I think you have to worry about some legal issues that I'm not an expert in, regarding whether you require it absolutely from every toy and how you define a toy. Is it this small or that small or a little bit bigger? But it's certainly something that is going to have to be activated at some point, because most people don't do it out of malice. They simply have the lack of knowledge, and they haven't been exposed to some of the limitations that are in the law for these types of vehicles.
All right. Well, of course, the geofencing has to be dynamic, because I mean, the most, you know, thing that has interfered most in my part of the country is people flying these things into active forest fires, and we have to take out all of the aircraft until it goes away.
Absolutely.
So, yes, Dr. Goodwin, or Mr. Goodwin.
To your comment about dynamic geofencing, that's exactly the kind of technology that AirMap is developing and deploying. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we partnered with the Department of Interior to get a more robust set of wildfires into our data sets, so that those responsible manufacturers that are actually doing geofencing now would be able to avoid worrying about any consumer choice, but the drones wouldn't be able to even take off if they were within a certain proximity of a wildfire. We've taken that a step further for local first responders as well. So I just want to re-echo that I don't think it's so much a technology problem as it is some of the line drawing exercises that we have to go through as to what the threshold is where that technology should apply.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I very unapologetically, at every opportunity I can, promote and highlight the work that the FAA's Premier Technical Center, which is in my district, continues to do with engineers and laboratories that are unmatched anywhere, and the partnership that they formed with the private sector. So for anyone on the panel, I believe in many respects that the Technical Center is somewhat underutilized, especially when it comes to their expertise with drones and unmanned aerial systems. Any ideas or suggestions what can be done additionally to help validate what many of you are developing, separately from the federal government?
I would say that many of the technologies that we're going to need to move on to advanced, beyond remote identification, which we've already discussed, and things of that nature, the ability to sense and avoid is really, really critical, not just for small drones, but for larger drones that are going to operate in the flight levels. These are the kinds of technologies that start to leverage, I think, the expertise that exist at the Technology Center, because we want them, when we talk about true integration, we want the ability to interact with manned aircraft, both in an airport environment as well as up in the sky. So I think the ability to get to true integration is going to require that kind of expertise, and the FAA in its rulemaking is going to need to require on data and research that is actually, it's validating itself. So I think that's an extremely important role for the Tech Center.
Anyone else? Yes, Doctor.
If I may, I think of where drones are going to have to get to in, let's say, 5 to 10 years in order to be pervasive, as not a set of aircraft, but rather a network system. So the technologies that need to be understood in order to regulate them, to further their capabilities and goals, are really not just in the realm of aerospace engineering, but also information technology, computer science, perception, autonomy, so on and so forth. So if you ask the question, what would I recommend that the FAA Tech Center is allowed to do in order to be more responsive to this new development environment, I think is the question of trying to acquire the talent in all of these different fields that were not traditionally part of commercial aviation in order to be able to authoritatively say where we should go in the future.
Yes, Mr. Goodwin.
And this is a theme I'll probably revisit a number of times, but I do think that the UAS Integration Pilot Program reflects a unique opportunity to leverage some of the expertise at the Tech Center as part of a broader application to that program to test in the real world some of the developments that we're going to need to see happen over a longer-term basis. So I think that we're seeing opportunities for the Tech Center's abilities to be leveraged that didn't exist before because there weren't the same opportunities to implement those technologies in real life and test that research in real-world situations.
Mr. Ball, I don't know if you're familiar with work at the Tech Center or have any ideas in this area?
I'm not specifically familiar with the Tech Center, but in general in the utility business, we are huge believers in piloting first. We're generally a very conservative, risk-averse universe of companies, and so working with centers like you've mentioned is kind of in our history. We work strongly as a group of utilities with the Electric Power Research Institute on drone research, really use case, kind of playing out use cases. So anything we could do with the center in helping us validate use cases, and then some of the things these men have mentioned as well, would be very helpful to us.
Okay. Rick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will take my 5 minutes for my questions. So, Dr. Alonso, could you just start off by maybe answering this question? What do you think specifically legislatively that we would need to do versus separating that from what FAA needs to do from a regulatory perspective? What would be our job on the committee to facilitate further integration?
So in my written testimony, I suggested that the regulatory process need to proceed in a more regular cycle. So we need to see updates to things like Part 107 every 6 months to a year, with the expectation that certain new regulations are going to be in place for the developers of drone systems to be able to plan ahead to deploy their systems according to those regulations. So I would like to see more flights, has been expressed here, more data informing these regulations, and these regulations happening in a more periodic cycle.
Yeah, but that isn't necessarily a legislative action we need to take. I mean, we could direct FAA to do that. We direct agencies to do a lot of things, and they don't meet those timelines. Nothing against that. That's just the history around here. So
I guess what I'm implicitly suggesting is that, you know, a little bit more pressure may need to be applied to the FAA in order to try to get these regulations happening more frequently. Otherwise, other countries are going to overtake us. And they have a tremendously difficult job ahead of them. Yeah. They're the regulators for safety. Right. They don't want to be the first ones to actually issue a regulation that causes an accident. But we must begin, and I don't know if you have the authority to do this, with regulatory updates for the things that pose extremely low safety risks. You know, we have gentlemen here that are talking about beyond visual line of sight operations in areas where there's no population whatsoever. Those things should be proceeding along almost immediately.
Yeah. And I think in your second, I think it was your second recommendation about data sharing. Is there anything, are there any obstacles to data sharing either from testing and research, from public to private sector, from private sector to public sector, from the data results?
Yeah, of course, you know, when we're talking about data, we're talking about data of all flights, but also the incidents and accidents that may occur during the operations of these UASs, so we may learn from them and avoid them proactively in the future. So there's a strong sensitivity to the data that may be provided and something that was a near miss or a near accident, et cetera, et cetera. But the FAA has tremendous experience with the ICAS system for commercial aviation, where this data can actually be cataloged and databased with proper de-identification, so you provide incentives for the operators to provide this data. And then the data can be made available to various parties for them to mine it and to understand what situations led to certain risks of safety that then can be proactively managed.
Yeah. Mr. Ball, other than inspections and you know, routine inspections as well as the inspections done during in light of the disasters, what other roles are you finding for your UAS teams?
Well, we've got a lot of creative folks, and this has really been a unique opportunity. Things as we have hydroelectric dams we're responsible for. Drones make a great way to inspect the dams really efficiently and effectively. Shoreline surveys around lakes behind those dams that we're responsible for that we have to do, a much more efficient process. At some of our solar energy facilities, inspecting the panels, it can easily be done. That's been a great process. Actually, in some of our coal plants, we have to monitor the volumetric amount of the coal there. We can do that with a drone, have done that. Wind turbine inspections, any sort of tower inspection. I mean, today, not only do we fly, say, the transmission lines on a regular basis, but on a not as frequent, but we still have to do it. We have to visually inspect the actual structure itself, and that's done with people walking on the ground, and we can do that, pre-program it with the drone, and it works very, very well. We've also been able to use drones actually inside of big boilers that we would normally have to let cool down, put in scaffolding, put people in there to inspect things. You can pre-program a drone to run in there. It's phenomenal.
We're getting near my time. As a son of a man who spent his life climbing poles,
yes,
and climbing down poles, I appreciate what a drone in 1968 might have meant to my dad.
Absolutely, sir.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's amazing.
All right, thanks. I'd like to do some follow-up with you all if I could, Mr. Ball, and further. Thanks. Thank you.
Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ball, on your testimony, you talk about being able to displace the use of manned aircraft with drones to inspect our infrastructure, reduce the safety risk to our employees. I 150% agree with you on that. And in Mr. Wynn's testimony, he talks about under Part 107, the FAA has granted more than 1,300 waivers to expand operations. Now, Mr. Ball, can you inspect transmission lines out of line of sight now, or do you get a waiver, or what's the status here? I'm trying to understand what's happening.
Yeah, actually at our company, we do not yet have a waiver for that. We, along with a bigger set of utilities, have made a request, and we're just waiting on that. But that's a very exciting opportunity for us.
Well, it would seem to me, you know, I've had transmission line going across one of my farms, so, you know, in the easement, and I don't know how far it goes up above the power lines, but it ought to be a no-brainer to be able to fly a drone, or, you know, unmanned vehicle within that a common sense, reasonable area of the easement. You know, if the easement's 100 feet, you know, across the surface and however far up, that you ought to have some, you know, and it shouldn't, you know, no planes are going to be flying there anyway. So I don't understand what the issue is here.
Well, I don't think there is a technological issue or even a safety concern. It's just a process opportunity that we need to get ironed out with the FAA.
So how long has it been that you've applied for the waiver, or the industry has?
I think it's been probably about a year now.
Okay, so it's just bureaucratic red tape. Is that what you're saying? I mean, this should be a no-brainer, shouldn't it?
I would hope
to be able to
yes,
inspect transmission lines, because
yes.
you know it's obvious that I've seen where they've had helicopters and planes fly over my transmission line, and they fly low, and you know there's always a danger there because you know, if you do it with the drone, it's just a lot of common sense. Makes a lot of sense. Mr. Wynn, your membership includes a lot of international companies. What have you really learned from in other countries? And I think I can tag that on with Mr. Goodwin. Has done a lot of drone work in multiple countries. You know, with I guess Switzerland and Japan. So I guess between the two, can you maybe enlighten us a little bit what's happening in these other countries and with the drone regulations, line of sight? I'm really keen on this line of sight issue. So either one.
There are places overseas where things might be a little bit more. There are things that are allowed that we don't regulate here. We don't have regulatory authority or permission to do here yet. But I think it's fair to say that Part 107, particularly with the waiver opportunity, has given us, you know, the path forward to getting to regulations. The last exchange, I think, was really critical to understanding the difference between a waiver environment and a regulatory environment. Once we've identified how to do that operation over miles and miles and miles of utility lines safely, we should regulate that. We should codify that and say, under these circumstances, you have the permission to do it. That way, all utility companies now know how to do that, or service providers know how to do that, rather than having to seek a waiver.
I just interrupt
we don't quite have that yet abroad.
Mr. Ball, if we're looking to out of line of sight in transmission line inspection and that easement, what would be the maximum height that you would need above a power line, or you know what?
You know, actually it would be very close. Certainly, probably no more than 100 or so feet above. I actually think what we were seeking before was well, maybe 200 to 200 feet, no more than that, something in that range. So it's and all within the right of way.
All within the right of way. That's yes. So I guess Mr. Wynn and Mr. Goodwin would agree that should be, you know, not really an issue.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of room to set a threshold that is reasonably low that allows operators to pursue these kinds of operations. Just to your previous point about our experience overseas, what we've really seen is that what you just described with a plane flying low over your property, or the issue that's specific to an easement, ultimately that's going to invite a lot of challenges that have to be resolved at a local level. You're going to have some kind of comfort level with either the landowner or either with the relevant authorities. And what we've seen is some embracing in a variety of jurisdictions of solving those problems collaboratively and getting the various levels of government in the same room. And I think that's given other jurisdictions an advantage for AirMap, where it makes more sense to partner. I do want to call out the pilot program, and again, as a mechanism that I think is forcing that collaboration to happen here. So a great opportunity for us to reclaim the lead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being here. As I sit here and listen, I realize how much we need to be looking at safety and considering the state of which I come. We have lots of wide open spaces and very little regulation. But I really do believe that the drones are going to present a real challenge in safety unless we have some way to determine the number that should be in certain spaces at certain times and what types. There are toys and there are real serious delivery systems. And I realize that safety will be a prime concern. Just recalling the Black Hawk helicopter incident that happened, that's really the tip of what can happen. So I'm just trying to determine, where do we begin to look at the privacy, the challenges that we see emerging through this integration of the unmanned drones? What steps are we taking now to address the privacy concerns as we are handling consumer data, safety, the number? It seems to me that we could be pretty much encumbered with a number of regulations that could be somewhat troubling, but how do we get around it? Anybody who'd like to address it? Yes.
Yeah, I think your question goes to a point that you've heard echoed on the panel before, which is that a lot of these issues need data, and we haven't had access to a lot of data because we haven't had the volume of operations, certainly not the volume of compliant operations that I think folks like the Southern Company could perform that would generate data that helps solve some of those hard questions around privacy, around security, which are legitimate. And so you'll hear me say this again, I think the pilot program is the prime mechanism that we have domestically today to start generating that data. And what Congress can do is ensure that the FAA does have the support necessary to make that program a success. What we saw in previous examples where we adopted a waiver process is that a couple folks out the gate get a waiver, and then the backlog becomes significant. So you have folks like the Southern Company waiting a year in order to get a waiver. So that's where I think if we adopt a waiver-based approach, we're never going to generate the data that we need to actually come to that kind of granular level of problem solving that you're describing. So where Congress can act, I think, is to help support the pilot program and ensure that it has the resources necessary to start a lot of commercial operations in that mechanism.
Yes.
Just to follow on with Mr. Goodwin, I think the opportunity in the utility space is to allow us to start in areas that aren't as urban as we were talking about before, and there is a lot of information to be learned there. So I actually think there's, and Dr. Alonzo mentioned these types of things in his testimony, you know, there's a way to step into this, and but we just need to get stepping.
Yes.
If I may, you mentioned safety, which is what we're most concerned with in addition to privacy. But safety is really a product of the risk of something happening and the consequence of that thing that is bad happening. So I think what Mr. Ball is saying is that there are plenty of opportunities where the consequence is very, very low. You're flying over unpopulated areas. We must get going with these types of test programs, acquiring all the data under those very low safety risk situations in order to be able to say something meaningful about situations where the safety risk is higher or the privacy issues become significant.
Ma'am, thank you for your question. We're always somewhere on a continuum of safety, privacy, security in this industry, and the objective is clearly to get to scale. We don't see the value and the benefits that we've described until we're at scale, and we've seen this with other technologies. So it's a bit of an iterative process, and data is extremely important, as has been indicated. The FAA has the safety part, right? They don't have necessarily the privacy part. We have great collaboration with the FAA and other regulators around the world. The privacy part, we worked very, very closely with many civil liberties organizations in an NTIA process the previous president asked us to participate in. We came up with volunteer guidelines on how to protect people's privacy. I'm sure everyone in the room would agree privacy is paramount to getting to scale. We can't be violating people's privacy and expect to get to scale. Similarly with security, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, we are ready and are engaging with the national security agencies to talk about how to address those issues. And I also sit here representing the counter-UAS community as well, which stands at the ready to help geofence and do things in an active way to keep the airspace safe.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ball, I'd like to start with you, if I could. I want to kind of piggyback onto what my colleague Mr. Gibbs was talking about in regards to line of sight, visual line of sight issues. In Section 2210 of the 2016 FAA bill, to work beyond visual line of sight flights for activities to inspect, repair, construct, maintain, or protect facilities, including critical infrastructure. To your knowledge, has the FAA made progress to implement this provision and allow owners of critical infrastructure like Southern Company to maintain that infrastructure?
It's my understanding that we're still waiting on that guidance from the FAA on basically what are the criteria we need to meet. And that, as I think Mr. Godwin or Mr. Wynn mentioned before, that's really what we need. We're a very compliant type of company. We deal with compliance all the time. We just need some more clarity around the rules.
So hopefully we'll get that clarity with the second panel with the FAA coming up. This is a question for any of the panelists who would like to answer. I introduced an amendment to the FAA bill to create somewhat of a micro drone category. And I think it's today's technology. We shouldn't have to have anyone climb a power pole again to inspect. And we shouldn't have to have any claims adjuster climb up on top of a roof anymore with today's technology that's in front of us. My micro drone category would have been created for drones that are 4.4 pounds or less, that travel no more than 40 knots and can be used within the visual line of sight. Now, would this classification promote innovation and actually help in the safety of companies like yours, Mr. Ball, or those that make up your association, Mr. Wynn? You know, would this new class be something that we could then get the FAA to then focus on those structures and critical infrastructure issues and waivers that we've already talked about? Who wants to go?
It might. It's you know, with miniaturization, there are going to be more and more drones that are smaller and smaller. And on the one hand, they represent less of a threat, less of a security or a safety issue, I'll say. You know, there are other things that are going on that sort of, I think when we started an ARC on flight over people, it was originally called the micro UAS ARC with that thought. Where this has gone, and companies like CNN are designing very, very small drones that can bring you the news, but if they come down on somebody's head, they're going to literally, they will not do any damage. They're literally, they break off, and you know, there's frangibility and so forth, and they're very, very light drones. But I think, you know, the airspace, it's I think a fair debate to say that the airspace needs to be governed by regulation. There might be a threshold below which that the harm is so de minimis that it's not worth regulating. But I reference our discussion at the registration ARC. There were a lot of aviation organizations represented in that room that almost no size is viewed as non-threatening, right? So I think it's an ongoing debate as to whether or not the weight of something or the size of something reduces its threat and therefore makes it a candidate to not be regulated.
Yeah, we're well aware of some of the initial opposition. However, I think as we've clearly heard through your testimony and in previous hearings here, that the FAA is just not doing its job to process waivers to actually allow for drone technology to be implemented in our airspace. And frankly, size of drone technology, I think, does matter when it comes into question, especially when we're talking about hopefully creating a tool that's used in a toolbox versus something that requires an FAA waiver. Would anybody else like to address the micro drone issue?
Well, I actually would have to agree with Mr. Wynn. I don't know that I know a perfect answer to it, but again, whatever the size of the drone, for us, it's just a matter of knowing what the rules are and having confidence in the rules, and then we'll live within the rules. You know, for me, you're right, a small drone is a tool, and it can be a very handy tool, and What we found with our employees is once you give them a new tool, give them the ability to use it within some set of parameters, their creativity is unbelievable. And so we would enjoy having the ability to use really drones of all sizes. I understand the smaller ones could be a benefit locally. We're actually very excited also on the other end. I understand that has bigger implications, you know, for bigger payloads, using them for construction and other things.
Well, my fear is that if we don't begin to separate out micro drone technology, we're going to continue to be faced with the same problems within the regulatory environment that all of you mentioned in your testimony. And that, to me, would be a travesty. So thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wynn, you had briefly discussed remote ID in response to a question by Ranking Member DeFazio. So I'd like to go a little further into that. First, if there's any update on the progress of rulemaking that you might be able to give us, but I'd really like you to tell us why remote ID is so important.
The update, I think, would probably be from Mr. Elwell, but I'm given to understand that the report from the remote ID ARC is imminent. So we'll have that, and then hopefully followed quickly thereafter by an NPRM, and then we start that process. I think it's extremely important, as is registration, to sort of build this process of visibility that we need in the airspace, and that, you know, that there's a whole variety of ways that can be done, ground-based as well as platform-based, or some combination of those two things. But suffice it to say that we as an organization are against anonymous flying. Today, if someone gets in an aircraft and takes off, generally speaking, it's visible to everyone in the system, and it's visible because they are in a system of systems. So similar to if you're waiting on someone to arrive and you look up their flight number on FlightAware, I can now see on my iPad an aircraft that's been called for me by air traffic control. I can see its tail number, et cetera, thanks to ADSB. This is just what we do in aviation. Aircraft need to be visible to one another so that we can avoid conflicts. It's going to be even more important for unmanned aircraft when we've got UTM, and those unmanned aircraft need to give way to manned aircraft, say an EMS helicopter that's coming through an urban area, et cetera, et cetera. They need to be detecting one another, they need to be identifiable to one another, and they need to be responsive to one another.
And as we have more operations of UAVs, how do we pay for the burden on the system?
I would defer to Mr. Goodwin, because I think we have the beginnings of that, which I tagged up on in Lance. His company, as well as Skyward, are the two organizations from the private side that are essentially bringing the tools to the operations community that tie into that system of systems that the FAA is providing, including basically automatic airspace authorizations, et cetera. Those are the building blocks for UTM. It remains to be seen how that burden gets shared, but I can promise you it will be a shared burden between industry bringing its tools to the table, as well as the FAA providing its back-end systems.
So, Mr. Goodwin.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Wynn. As Mr. Wynn noted, we do have experience with this in the public-private partnership model that the FAA established with Lance and used there, both with our work also domestically with cities and states, and then overseas with ANSPs and other entities that we're working with. We've seen really a variety of models here. So I think I'm less concerned about the fact of how any burdens on the system are going to be paid for, and more that when we start to realize meaningful economic activity, service providers or companies like the Southern Company, they're going to be able to rationalize any costs they have to bear so long as they're adding meaningful value. And that's always going to be the burden on industry to generate sufficient value that those costs are worth bearing.
Dr. Alonso.
And if I may, I don't know if you're aware, but the FAA Drone Advisory Council has set up 3 groups to investigate different things. The Technical Working Group 3 is looking at the issue of how this whole process is going to be funded, and their recommendations are due to the spring 2018 meeting of the Drone Advisory Council. So studies are looking at various different options and trying to figure out what's a fair way of distributing that burden.
Thank you. And I don't have much time left in this more complicated question, but let me throw it out there. Sense and avoid technology. Where are we at right now? Who wants to take the stab at that one? All right, Mr. Goodwin seems to want to.
I'll just offer a small comment. I think that sense and avoid technology has to be complemented for commercial operations at scale with a UTM system. Candidly, the more miniaturized drones get, the more challenging it's going to be to have an onboard sense and avoid that gives you the complete 360-degree awareness. However, with a persistent wireless connection that's sufficiently high bandwidth, you can have a much higher visibility into the airspace around you. So I think we're going to see a blend of those technologies and with connected drones of the future.
Thank you. Nice quick answer. I'll yield back.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this committee, and thanks to all the guests here. Wonderful to see you all. Mr. Wynn, you had said earlier that you thought that the state and local units of government should play a role in developing a federal framework. I want to focus on that a little bit because, as you know, I've been trying to address the issue of federalism versus preemption and trying to find a sweet spot there. We have had a great experiment in this country. The concept of dual sovereignty, the idea that instances that affect two citizens of the same state would be governed by the state's police power, and if you have a federal nexus or interstate commerce, the federal government would handle that. And it's worked quite well. It's worked quite well because we don't like the consolidation of power in this country. We like the idea of these great experiments in the several states arriving at good solutions. So as it pertains to this emerging and wonderful new technology, I do want to ask you if you think that the tribal, state, local governments should have no ability whatsoever to directly create, say, a time, manner, place, or some sort of restriction on low-level, small UAS as long as it doesn't interfere with interstate commerce. They should still have no say at all?
No.
Legally?
No, I did not say that, and I would not say that. Is the mic on? Okay. I think the question that's begging, sir, is how? How would they have the ability to do that?
Are you sure your mic is on?
The mic?
You sure your mic is on?
Yep, it's lit, so.
Pull it
there we go.
Closer.
There we go.
All right, I'm going to start over again, sir.
You bet.
I did not say that. What the question that is being begged here, and I'm going to defer on the question of, the way you contextualized it, which I think is very relevant, but I think it's probably a longer answer than you wish for, is that at the end of the day, there's a workability question here, which I think the pilot project, which we've been strongly supporting, has the opportunity to help us solve. And I hasten to say that I think that in many instances, with a lot of the questions that we're discussing, we will be in a different place 6 months from now and on different complexes of issues than we are today. On this one in particular, I have had numerous conversations with people who are responsible for public safety or municipal authorities. And the question that always comes up is how would I do that? How would I manage my airspace?
Well, okay, let me just interject, because in your statement you said that you thought state and local and tribal government should play a role in developing a federal framework. A federal framework, as though they would have no framework themselves. And my question is simply, if somebody is buzzing past a school or hovering in my backyard looking in the window upstairs, I'm going to call the FAA? No, I'm going to call the zoning board. I'm going to call the police department. I'm going to call a local authority. That's where the police power comes into effect, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Goodwin, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, happy to comment. I think we've seen both here in the U.S. and then overseas that safe commercial drone operations only happen at high volumes if you get every level of government involved to solve some of these really complicated questions. I'd take the analogy of comparing, the relative space of planes and automobiles. So in the automotive space, states and localities create time, manner, and place restrictions on cars. You have a highway speed limit that the state may set. You may make a street walkable like where we work in Santa Monica, so no cars are allowed at all, and maybe trash trucks aren't allowed to come in the middle of the night. Those are reasonable restrictions that don't necessarily impede effective commercial activity, and they're implemented at the state and locality level. And all those are, of course, available in real time through apps like Waze, which can tell me when I'm speeding at times. And so comparing the volume of activity that engenders, the FAA, Air Traffic Organization, provides service to more than 42,000 flights a day, which is a significant economic benefit to the company, to the country, excuse me. But the Department of Transportation estimates that there's 1.1 billion car trips per day. So comparing the relative scale, I think that we can say that that doesn't sound like a burdensome regulatory framework. It sounds like highly valuable economic activity.
And I would only add, and thank you everyone on the panel for your testimony today, this is a wonderful, brave new world. We've got to embrace this technology and I want the best for the industry. My concern, in all sincerity, is if we don't find a satisfactory statutory scheme here, something worse will come down the road in a court decision or something worse for the industry. So I hope we can all work together and find this sweet spot I've been trying to work on, and so we can embrace this new technology and still pride ourselves and still embrace that wonderful idea of local control. I yield back.
Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate this very important hearing. Comes at a time when a lot of us are thinking about drones in connection with their commercial uses. Now, I represent a unique district, to be sure. The nation's capital, the District of Columbia. It has been declared a, there's the word that's used, no drone zone. So that if you live in the nation's capital, almost 700,000 people do, I am interested as the nation prepares for commercial uses of drone to have things delivered by drone. By the way, this includes parts of near-in parts of Maryland and Virginia. Whether you think this 15-mile ring, it's a 15-mile ring, where drones cannot fly, if that is what they do, without FAA authorization. I ask you whether you think that's, obviously I have to think about safety first, and that's what I'm thinking. Now I'm trying to think about the commercial uses of drones to deliver packages at Christmas, for example. Whether you think something can be done to make sure that drones fly within this 15-mile zone, the nation's capital, safely for commercial purposes. I don't know if Mr. Alonzo, Mr. Nguyen, or any of you have any ideas on that, but I'd be grateful to have them.
Well, I would say that a blanket prohibition of any type of drone, any size, any speed, any capabilities, without any particular specification of what requirements.
It says without, and I'm not going to be here when the FAA testifies, without specific FAA authorization. Do you believe what is envisioned is a unique system for flying within this 15-mile radius? And by the way, this could apply to everybody else's residential area too, if that was considered to be a zone where there may be some kind of secure facility as well.
But obviously the current regulation in this area is one that is coming from issues of security. So I think we're being absolutely safe and secure, but I think there are many opportunities to enable commercial drone use even within the Washington, D.C. area with more logical regulations as to what's permitted and what's not.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge there is to actually find the right way to say yes to drones. And it's not just to commercial operations, it's to drones operated by first responders or helping provide situational awareness to police. There's a lot of different uses of drones that could be constructive. They don't have to be purely commercial and save lives, as we've seen. In that context, how do you say yes to drones that you know are going to be compliant? And that's, I think, where the digital infrastructure of UTM is going to be so important. So I think there may be an opportunity to explore even places as sensitive as Washington, D.C., through the pilot program by virtue of surfacing all the hard questions about how do you mitigate the security concerns, how do you have a combination of counter-UAS and compliant drones operating so that you can discriminate between people who are flying with permission and flying those who aren't. That is where I see the opportunity to actually stress test whether we could operate safely in, obviously, the most sensitive airspace in the U.S.
I appreciate the notion of a pilot program. The right way to say yes may be encompassed in these words without specific FAA authorization. It does seem to me we ought to be able to get there that way. Is coordination being done with the Department of Defense? Is there concern in this age of terrorism that drones, not only here but elsewhere, could be used, or is this going on just with the FAA, which has the major responsibility? Does any of you know, have an answer to that question?
My organization works very closely with...
Would you speak up, please?
Sure. My organization works very closely with the Department of Defense, particularly JIDO, on how to handle the use of drones, particularly outside of the continental United States. There are things inside of the continental United States that make that a more challenging policy discussion. FAA, FCC regulations, rules that prevent the disablement of an aircraft, which I'm in favor of, and so forth. So there are some subtleties here that are being looked at on how to implement counter-drone technology in security type in a security type context. Overseas, it's a little bit easier when our troops are directly threatened or our allies are directly threatened. But we are, as an industry, working with them to develop those technology security solutions.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be interested as well in any involvement of the Department of Defense with this very important issue. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ball, I wanted to start with you. I send you a check once a month, and I'm grateful to you for keeping the lights on. Thank you for that. I want to pick up where Mr. Davis left off. He asked you about some a legislative change that we worked on together here. You've been waiting about that same period of time on your waiver request. Tell me what the impact is in terms of operations if we get guidance for the legislation first, or if you get approval on your waiver first.
Interesting. Well, number one, thank you for paying your power bill. We love all our customers.
To be fair, I get threatening notes when I don't, so
okay,
it's a relationship.
Your question, I don't know that I've fully grasped it, but, you know, as soon as we can, I mean, right now, if we could get a waiver, that would be great. But I would agree with some of the things that were kind of said earlier. If we can move to an environment where instead of seeking waivers, we have a clear set of rules that we can work under to allow us to do beyond visual line of sight operation, that is a much better environment than having to ask for waiver by waiver by waiver.
And so my expectation is when the guidance comes out for the section that Mr. Davis references, we will no longer be talking about waivers for any critical infrastructure provider in the country.
That would be our hope. It's just give us the rules and we'll work within them.
We talked about revisiting rules every 6 months. I think that was you, Dr. Alonzo, who said we need to be in a rapid regulatory framework. Talk to me a little bit about that. Is that because technology is moving on a 30-day cycle, and so regulating on a 180-day cycle makes sense? I worry about changing the rules every 180 days for folks who are trying to find some certainty in this space. I know you're supportive of performance-based standards as opposed to prescriptive standards, but talk to me about the industry dangers of a frequent regulatory process instead of a certain regulatory process.
In an industry where safety is paramount, you have to be extremely careful, and thus the wheels, the government moves slowly when it comes to regulations for a reasonable reason, I would say. But when I was talking about updates to the rules, I wasn't meaning changes to rules that permit the same thing with different requirements over time, but rather updates to the rule that enable certain services and keep those rules for a significant period of time until there is additional knowledge that informs us to change them. So what I would like to see is more rules in the next 6 months to allow beyond visual line of sight when you're flying over unpopulated areas, right? Or rules for flights over people when you have drones that are relatively small and you're staying within visual line of sight, and those types of things. So the periodic updates were referring to additional level of service with additional level of requirements, not to changing the requirements over time. Yeah.
Now, when we talk about safety, those of you who are so intimately involved seem to talk about safety from a drone level up. When you listen to folks here who may not have as much UAS experience, we're talking about safety from the drone level down. I'm less worried about it getting sucked into an engine. I'm more worried about it falling on my head. Where is the regulatory holdup there as we struggle to to balance safety and technological advancement. If I ask the same question to the FAA, are they going to tell me that what slows the process down is the inability to deal with safety going up, or a worry about safety going down?
I think the answer depends on the category of drone that you're talking about. Certainly for the larger ones, going up is a significant and maybe a more substantial risk, but for the smaller ones, going down is a very important thing that we need to worry about, not to impact the uninvolved public. My take on this is that what is slowing things down is that we don't have enough data to know exactly where to set the thresholds for the requirements for either the ones going up or the ones going down. We're learning about it, but we need to accelerate that learning.
And so when many of you have talked about folks like Mr. Ball and the work that Southern Company could do to generate that data, Mr. Goodwin mentioned that specifically, my assumption when we talk about generating data is we're going to generate some failures in that space, that from an industry perspective, the position is, let's give Southern Company the tools to do this, let's anticipate failures, and we're going to learn from those failures, and we're just going to be comforted by knowing that failure is going to occur in unpopulated rural Georgia as opposed to over New York City. Is that the answer that we've seen overseas as well, Mr. Goodwin?
I think it is, and I think also just to reiterate the point I made earlier, the closer you get to the ground and more specific the concerns of the people on the ground, the more you need to ensure that there's a voice for all the relevant folks, both at the state and local level, and then, of course, obviously the individual citizens. So I think the pilot program is the first opportunity to generate that data where all those voices are going to be heard, and hopefully it'll generate a lot of that information that we haven't seen to date.
I appreciate the nice words you all had to say about our chairman. My experience is sometimes folks get their very best work done, Mr. Chairman, after they've announced their retirement. These next 14 months may be the most productive 14 months we've seen. I think our folks are in good hands here today.
Reserve comment. Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Alonso, I wanted to ask you a question. You've talked a lot today about accelerating learning, more data, more testing. I think in your testimony you said all of this must be significantly enhanced. So I'm just trying to get an idea from you what that means exactly in terms of where we are today and what is significant enhancement in your mind.
Let me take a little detour. If you accept that drones today have 1 accident in every 1,000 flights, that means you must observe 1,000 flights before you see a single accident. Obviously, you don't want to see just 1 accident. You want to see tons of accidents where there's no consequence. That means instead of 1,000 flights, you have to look at tens or hundreds of thousands of flights and data points. This is the point I was trying to make in my testimony. So when I say significantly enhance, to your question, I mean that we cannot have pilot programs that have 4 participants, right, doing 2 or 3 flights a month or something. We have to have hundreds of participants doing hundreds of flights a month and accumulate that data over a significant period of time.
And is that where we are today?
I think we're in a very, very small scale.
Very small scale.
They're excellent flight test programs, and I give kudos to both Congress and to the FAA for starting them, but I think we need to, quote unquote, significantly enhance them.
And then to compare what we are doing today to where others in Japan or Switzerland, other international communities where you've expressed concern that we may be falling behind in terms of R&D?
So I think they're starting, but they're not significantly ahead of us. There's some simpler regulatory environments, but I like to make the analogy more to driverless cars. You know, when you look at the amount of testing that is actually being done to figure out when and how these cars should be allowed to go on the roads, we're talking about millions of hours of driving accumulated by a number of different companies. I think we need to go in autonomous drones in a very similar direction.
Thank you. And this is a question more for anybody really on the panel, and I'm a little new in my learning around this issue. So, but there have been, you've previously talked about issues and our concerns around privacy, security, et cetera. And I think Mr. Ball or Dr. Alonso, I'm not sure, responded by saying, well, we could start to learn more by simply flying in unpopulated areas. So I'm having a hard time understanding what we learn flying drones in an unpopulated area. It seems like, well, there is no safety issue necessarily. I mean, you're out in the open space. So if you could enlighten me.
Well, I think what was being discussed was part of the learning is, to Dr. Alonzo's point, is when you do have an accident or when there's a failure of a piece of equipment, how does the equipment react to it? What do you see? And if you have a failure, like Mr. Woodall just said, in the middle of a field in Georgia, that's unfortunate. We don't like that, but we can learn from it, and then that can be you can take those learnings and then say, okay, if that had happened in the Washington, D.C. area, you know, what would the impact have been? So it's just something as simple as that, I believe.
Well, it seems to me that there's so many different types of UASs. I mean, there's lots of manufacturers. I guess you could group them into certain categories, but it seems like that's an inordinate amount of data points that I'm not sure you can, draw a line between them.
Well, take for comparison the commercial aviation system. It's got similar diversity, and the failures can be equipment, although they're very, very rare, but it can be operations, and normally it's a combination of effects that lead to a particular failure. We have over 1 million drones, right, in the U.S. right now. We could expand the way in which we collect data as to when these things fail, or where they almost fail, in a much more large-scale way. I think this is the main point. And yes, there'll be a lot of data, but it's the best hope we have to actually impose logical regulations.
So is there another example of what we would learn flying in unpopulated areas, Mr. Goodwin?
Yeah, I'll offer very briefly an example that I think touches upon what Mr. Woodall said. The number of stakeholders that you have to be concerned about when it comes to privacy and security are significantly fewer in relatively low density areas. So it's easier to get them into a room. It's easier to talk to a handful of folks and find a technology means of addressing their solution than it would be, say, in an urban environment. So I think that just from a simple crawl, walk, run kind of approach, a lot of those learnings are going to be applicable because, candidly, a lot of folks that we've encountered in some of the more rural environments do have strong sense of private property and concerns about privacy, and they'd be more than happy to participate in the benefits of technology so long as their concerns are addressed. So it's the right population to really try to get those learnings on, simply because of the scale, and the scale relative to the scale of the commercial opportunity, which is significant.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Alonzo, you serve on the key FAA Advisory Council on drones, and I've got an article that's a few months old that said that we had almost 800,000 U.S. drones registered in the first 15 months, and that that was going to go on up to an estimate by the FAA that there would be 3.5 million by 2021. I don't know if those estimates are still accurate because that's a few months old. But if we have 3.5 million drones in 3 or 4 years, is there any realistic way that we can keep up with all of that, or that we could? It seems to me you would end up with millions, because this same article says we've got 320,000 manned aircraft registered after 100 years of registration. So what do you think about that? I mean, it seems to me we'll end up with millions of unregistered drones.
I think because the barrier to registration has been lowered so significantly, I think maybe we should require that these drones are registered at the point of purchase. But I think this tremendous growth that you're talking about is really happening in the very small range of the UASs. So I think there's been some discussion already today as to various means that could actually get under control that very large growth in the very small range of UASs that are not going to be flying beyond visual line of sight and above people, and that are mostly operated by you, myself, and maybe our kids doing relatively simple things.
Well, just yesterday, Bloomberg News reported, it says, the millions of small civilian drones flying the nation's skies can cause significant damage to airliners and business jets in a mid-air collision, new research commissioned by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration concluded. While most drones weigh only a few pounds, they include motors and other metal equipment that could cause significant damage to aircraft engines, windshields, or wings, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have concern about that?
Absolutely, but we talked about technologies like geofencing and others that may significantly reduce that risk if imposed on these small drones that you're discussing at the moment. Right,
Yes.
so you want to make sure that none of these millions of drones that are going to be in the very small scale are going to be in the path of an airliner. And I think we have the technology to do that, so.
Mr. Goodwin, you mentioned a key word to most people on this issue just a moment ago, and that's privacy. And I understood at another hearing that we had a few months ago on drones that they can make drones as small as an insect now, or you know, I don't know what that how far that goes. But are you satisfied? Do you feel comfortable that we're doing enough to alleviate all the privacy concerns that are out there? I know in Los Angeles, when the Los Angeles Police Department was starting to increase its use of drones, there was quite an outcry from private citizens. What do you think about that?
I think particularly with the increase in miniaturization, we're going to only see this grow as an issue. That being said, I do think there's room for a lot of privacy issues, and we should perhaps not lump them all together to be solved by existing laws that are on the books that might apply to other technologies as well. So a lot of what we've seen in terms of, you can say Google Glass or other technologies that allow you to record someone without necessarily them being a parent may apply. Some of the lessons learned from those technologies may apply in the context of drones. Just separately, I'd call attention to the privacy concerns from government operators, which I think we have a very healthy mechanism in this country for elevating those kind of concerns when it comes to government action and leading to best practices around those operations. And I think that practice of finding the best practices for a government operator, the way that they store the data, the way that it has to be accessible, there's a lot that can be learned from the high-scale commercial industry to solve some of those privacy concerns on the commercial side. That doesn't necessarily address some of the other types of concerns that go perhaps down to the recreational level, but I do think there's a room to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good there.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I see my time is about up. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for your testimony today. Sometimes it's hard to see the forest from the trees, and I'll just leave that like that. I will ask you if anyone on the panel has an opinion about the pervasive anti-regulatory environment that has been perpetuated over the years, and whether or not it has had an impact on the FAA's ability to promulgate rules in this UAS environment. Does anyone have an opinion about that?
My opinion, sir, is it has not. We have.
There is no anti-regulatory environment that we exist under at this time? Or
we work very,
would you agree with me on that?
We work very closely with the regulators. If we don't have regulations under which we can fly or permission to fly, we don't fly. This industry doesn't scale. The site doesn't benefit from the technology.
Well, I understand. My question goes to the regulatory environment that exists at this time, and I guess you would disagree that we have an anti-regulatory environment, but I'm sure that others agree with me that we do have an anti-regulatory environment generally. And my question is, how does that, if it does, impact the promulgation of rules in this space? But let me, and you take your comments, you're well noted on that. What about the incessant budget cutting, including the FAA's budget over the years? Has that fact impacted the FAA's ability to promulgate rules in this UAS space? Anyone have an opinion on that? And I guess no one does.
Actually, sir, I'll take the opportunity to thank the subcommittee because we've seen actually additional resources provided to the FAA in order to move forward with this regulatory environment. I thank the subcommittee for that.
After the budget has been cut, you've seen resources added.
Yes, sir.
To try to equalize.
Earl Lawrence can speak to that. I'd also be happy to provide information for the record.
Okay, well, I'd love to see it, and I'm sure the American people who are thoughtful might want to see whether or not the resources we are providing to our agencies, including the FAA, during these times of austerity, have any impact on its ability to keep up with progress. I don't see any way that it cannot have an impact. That's my personal opinion. But I will ask Mr. Ball, sir, you mentioned in your testimony that during a recent hurricane, you were able to dispatch drones to Texas and help their utility with coming up with assessments as to damage. And you could have done more if the regulations had allowed you to do so. What regulations, other than the being able to see the drone in operation, what other regulations impacted your ability to not use drones as much as you would have wanted to down there?
Yeah, I think it was just as, well, one thing, it was as simple as this was one of the first times that drones were used in a mutual assistance sense. So there is some learning there. That's why I said when we, in the following month, when we did the same thing in Georgia, we had learned from Texas, but some of it was just waiting on waivers, waiting on permissions.
And these kinds of common sense, practical realities are impacted by our budgeting decisions here in Washington, D.C. I just wanted to make that point. And does anyone have any idea whether or not the proposed tax cuts that are working their way through Congress will have any impact on the ability of the federal agencies to operate efficiently and effectively in this area? I see no one is responding. I think that these are, when I said sometimes it's hard to see the forest from the trees, that is exactly what I was referring to. And with that, I will yield back.
Mr. Sanford.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me find my notes here. Back in October of 2015, this subcommittee held a similar hearing on the same subject, and at that time, I in essence asked the committee, how do we maximize safety while minimizing government involvement? And it was interesting that FAA Deputy Administrator Michael Whitaker at that time responded that he believed the best way to go down that path would be an industry-based standard so we don't have to go down the regulatory path. And obviously that's not in large measure the direction we're going, but I'll go back to the same question I asked back in 2015 of that committee, which is, I think in part tied to what my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, was getting at, which is, in essence, you can't have risk, you can't have riskless innovation. You can't have innovation without risk. And so the question I think we have to struggle with as policy folks is to say, how do we have more in the way of innovation, given what we've seen happen in the wake of hurricanes and other natural disasters, their utility that might come in the wake of the way retailers operate. There are just a lot of big possibilities out there. And so I guess one of the questions, it would seem to me that in answering that question, I was just talking again to Mr. Woodall, and there's a clear bifurcation in that when you talk about jet engines, you're clearly talking about federal standard and the importance of operations around airports, interstate travel. But when you operate dealing with peeping toms, local safety issues, rural power lines, fundamentally you're really operating at what has historically been handled at a local or state government level. Is there a system by which that you all could imagine operating in, particularly I'd ask you, Mr. Ball, wherein you'd have a bifurcation of responsibility? If you're close to Hartsfield Airport, you're going to be dealing with the FAA and all the appropriate federal regulatory agencies. But if you're operating in rural Georgia at a low altitude that really doesn't involve a big safety issue, is there a way to cover that at a local level? Give me your thoughts on that, again, because I think what we need to end up at as a place is a spot where we maximize innovation in this unfolding field while at the same time managing risk. And might that not be better done if you bifurcated responsibilities between federal and state or local duties?
I think, as Mr. Goodwin mentioned before, I agree with him. I do think there's an opportunity there to possibly do that. For a company like ours, whatever the structure is, we just need to know the rules. And so in a multi-layered regulatory environment, and we deal with that today in other areas, as long as we understand the rules, and the rules aren't so conflictive that it kind of leaves us wondering what we should do, that would be helpful. And it's been mentioned before, this pilot effort that people actually, I think, just now are making applications to could be very helpful here. And I think Dr. Alonso mentioned, the more of these pilots where we're involving municipal and county and state level folks in with the national rules so we can learn how these things could coexist, I think that's going to be very helpful, because I'm not imaginative enough to imagine all of the unintended consequences we might get, but I think we can work through them.
Then I ask you, Mr. Goodwin, in other words, historically it's not been the purview of the FAA to worry about peeping toms underneath a home in Hollywood, California. Are we trying to jam too much in terms of jurisdiction in at the federal level, or for that matter, again, covering the rural power line in Georgia? Is there a best practice that you've seen in another country? I'd love to learn more about the mapping that's taken place in Kansas. Are there insights that you'd offer from the standpoint of the federal state jurisdictional puzzle?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's certainly the global trend that most national authorities have looked at this issue and recognized you have to get every level of government in the room in order to enable high-volume commercial operations. And so you see that in Germany, where there's a delegation of authority down to the state level. We see the UK just announced a city-based drone innovation program. And you're seeing that in a variety of other
and how have they done that in such a way so that for Mr. Ball's organization, he's not having to contact 5 different, governmental jurisdictions to go ahead and check the power line or check the house that was damaged after a hurricane?
Absolutely. So I think there's a number of different nascent approaches, and I won't go through them all given the time constraints here, but I'd call attention again to the formation of the pilot program requires people to solve for exactly that problem. And by not isolating it to just be localities by themselves, but also the coordinating role that states can play, I'm encouraged, so long as we have congressional action to help support that pilot program and direct the FAA in that regard, that we're going to see those best practices emerge because of the volume of activity to solve those problems that we see occurring there.
I would ask other questions, but I see I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been a lot of very interesting talk. Mr. Goodwin, your company is in Southern California and leading the way in aerospace management of drones. In my district, San Gabriel Valley includes the foothills where we had multiple forest fires due to the drought, threatened hundreds of homes and evacuated thousands of people. At one point, the fire department was forced to stop the aerial firefighting due to presence of private drones. What can be done, or what is being done to stop the use of drones? Is it the responsibility of local cities to institute local ordinances? And how would they get the information to the general public? By the same token, are there any instructions in the sale of the drones to either register them or where they could be flown?
Yeah, so happy to answer the different parts of the question there. I think focusing on the information sharing side, that's where companies like AirMap play a role. There's a growing and thriving USS/UTM ecosystem of companies that are trying to aggregate that kind of data and then surface it for users. Ideally, in a perfect world, what you've heard is that it's not a discretionary act, but responsible manufacturers set geofences on their drones. Once you have a dynamic, persistent connection, you have a connected drone, then the fact of a wildfire is, I don't want to say it's an insignificant challenge, but it's a challenge that technology can solve for. We have computer-aided dispatch in our platform that people can automate their drones to not take off or to route around, and that includes things like local fires, not even just wildfires, which may be significantly larger. And I referenced it earlier, that was our partnership with the Department of Interior, which became public and a number of other companies participate in to surface that data. So I think there's a lot that technology can do there independent of any particular local action. In terms of what is the best practice, again, I think there's an opportunity through the pilot program to really test out the right regulatory models, just like we'll see companies testing out the right business models. And hopefully from that, we'll see a lot more data that gets directly on point. I think.
Does the FAA prohibit cities from instituting their own ordinances?
So I will direct that question to the FAA in the next panel. I think they've issued guidance, and there's obviously a balancing line between where the FAA's authority ends and where a city's authority begins.
Well, when you have the information, as Dr. Alonso was stating, who generates and who keeps and disseminates the information on the drones, and where is it stored? Who can have access to it?
You mean the information about ownership and location, or you mean information about flights
Generally,
and
all
accidents?
all of it, because it's a new technology that although it wasn't really new, 20-some-odd years ago, I spoke to a woman who was having drones for the movie industry.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in general what you need is a credible, honest, and neutral broker of that information, so you know that it's going to be provided accurately and that it's going to be represented accurately or portrayed accurately as well, I think.
But so far, who handles it?
Well, I imagine it will be the FAA in this particular case, right?
But the government moves very slow.
Yeah, although they've been successfully shown that this can be done for commercial aviation. I think with the aid of new information technologies with companies like AirMap and others, you may streamline the processes that led to the existing databases to make them much larger and much more available. So.
And does the industry talk to academia and to the FAA? Do they work in concert?
Yeah, I think so. I think all these pilot programs are essentially set up such that these types of communications do take place.
Well, in a visit to the Port of Los Angeles recently with Chairman Graves, the Port Police highlighted the concern they have on authorized users interested in the landmark status of port complex, flying drones unsafely through ships, cranes, and other equipment. And I'd like to know if you know what is being done to address unauthorized drones on those landmarks and the airports.
I don't think I can answer that.
Mr. Goodwin?
Specifically in reference to the port who we've chatted with, and I think there's a lot of really fascinating forward-thinking folks there. I think this is a great opportunity to show a combined picture of the airspace because on the flip side of the coin is the commercial operations that a number of folks within port facilities want to do to use drones. But to do that, you have to have a combined picture of the airspace, the good actors and the bad actors, or just perhaps reckless folks.
Or unknowingly.
Or unknowingly in that airspace.
Because you have an area where you have beaches and people decide to fly them, for recreation uses, and they fly by the ports.
Absolutely. So it creates a complicated airspace, and that's where I think companies like AirMap and counter-UAS companies can provide a combined picture of the airspace to help start to solve some of those problems.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is to the panel. The FAA estimates that the hobbyist UAS fleet will be more than triple the size in the next 4 years. On the commercial side, there'll be a tenfold increase. you know, this is becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry that will only grow in the future. You know, I represent an area that was once a thriving industrial district. I'd like to ask, what does this mean for American manufacturing? I know DJI, a Chinese company, is one of the biggest manufacturers of drones. Does anyone on the panel see where we can move forward in the United States in this effort?
Yes, sir. That's a great question. We have been forecasting a lot of economic activity, not only in the industry itself, but also value added to companies such as Southern Company, et cetera, for their business model. So I think it's very, very good for the economy. You know, our estimates, which are in my testimony, are as we integrate into the airspace, more and more value accrues. So we have a shortage of pilots in this country for manned aircraft, and a growing number of unmanned pilots for the commercial sector. Those unmanned pilots, increasingly as we get to automatic airspace authorizations, and automation is a word I've been trying to get out here during this panel, and I haven't gotten to it yet. But automation is really, really key, and more of that automation will enable scale. More people will make a living doing this, whether it be adding value to particular industries or, you know, repairing drones and of such nature.
Okay. Sir?
So I think one of the themes that you've heard is not just scale, but also the particular applications that we've heard, say, the Southern Company want to pursue. When we have high volumes of particular applications, it's going to create a much more rich ecosystem, a larger pie that other manufacturers can participate in. And that's where I think we're going to see some greater competition and greater opportunity for domestic industries when we see the airspace get unlocked to a whole variety of use cases where building to a particular use case might give them a competitive advantage.
And so also as this grows, as you were saying, Mr. Wynn, there'd be the opportunity for a larger market of pilots for these in industry, correct?
Absolutely, and we have been, we stood up our Remote Pilots Council earlier this year. Training is starting to come online. Trainers are starting to transition over to the unmanned space from the manned space, or to expand into that space. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and I come back to, we have a pilot shortage. This is a lower barrier to entry for pilots than, you know, and a way to get people interested in aviation, whether it be actually flying drones, designing the software, designing the middleware that goes into corporate and enterprise systems, all the way to the repair work that is going to be required.
Thank you. Mr. Ball.
Well, I would just like to say, too, I think as the industry expands and grows, it provides a great opportunity, too, for the men and women in the military who've learned how to fly unmanned aircraft there. This becomes a great job opportunity for them. And in the utility industry, we've been very focused on really reaching out to veterans and those folks who are coming out of the military. So I think there's a win-win for just a whole lot of sectors here.
Mr. Alonso.
Yeah, I think buried in your question is how we nurture the development of industries that utilize drones, develop drones, produce drones here in the U.S. And I think putting together, the best thing you can do is put together the infrastructure to enable large scalability. So many hundreds of thousands of drones flying simultaneously, such that these business cases can actually be built.
Well, thank you. You answered my second question, so I'll yield back.
Okay. Would like to thank our panel. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for willingness to work with us. We look forward to continuing the dialogue and continuing to try to find ways to move this forward so that we can best optimize the opportunities, so to speak. In this first panel, you are dismissed. Thank you. So just Elwell's having a statement, not Lawrence, or both of them?
Lawrence is there to answer questions.
Okay.
I think any questions should be directed to Elwell, and if you can.
Yeah, he'll push it off. Mr. Elwell, are you ready? Thanks. We'll now move to the second panel with Mr. Daniel Elwell, Deputy Administrator of the FAA. Mr. Elwell, you're recognized for your statement.
Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share what the FAA is doing to safely integrate unmanned aircraft technology.
Excuse me, could you pull the mic a little closer, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to share what the FAA is doing to safely integrate unmanned aircraft technology into our nation's airspace. And thank you, Chairman Lobiondo, for your years of public service. Your unfailing support of the FAA and the work performed at the Technical Center has been critical to the advancement of U.S. aviation, and we owe you a great debt of gratitude. Accompanying me today is Earl Lawrence, the Executive Director of the FAA's UAS Integration Office. Drones are the fastest growing field in aviation. What was once little more than a novelty is now used for commercial operations, public safety, law enforcement, and emergency response. There are 95,000 commercial drones operating in the United States, going places that would otherwise be dangerous for people or other vehicles. The influx of new casual drone users continues to escalate even beyond our most aggressive projections. It's estimated that the full integration of drones could reach a national economic benefit of $82 billion and 100,000 jobs within the decade. Within this context, the need for the United States to safely and fully integrate this technology into America's national airspace system must be a national priority, which is why we're here. Led by Secretary Chow, the Department of Transportation has developed an ambitious vision. The FAA, in close coordination with organizations across the U.S. government, intends to fully integrate unmanned aircraft into the national airspace system, with drones operating safely and seamlessly with manned aircraft. They will occupy the same airspace and use many of the same air traffic management systems and procedures. Most countries seek only to accommodate drones, relying largely on operational segregation to maintain systemic safety. The vision of the United States is bigger and better. We seek to integrate, not segregate. We've made significant progress since our last appearance before this committee. In August 2016, we implemented a rule to govern small drones called Part 107. It provides a working foundation for UAS integration while still providing flexibility to allow the FAA to keep pace with technological advances. Since then, the FAA has issued 70,000 remote pilot certificates, 1,100 operational waivers, and over 10,000 authorizations for controlled airspace operations. We agree with Congress. Challenges remain. The FAA's 2016 extension pointed to physical security, cybersecurity, privacy, and enforcement. In recognizing these challenges, the President directed us to launch a UAS integration pilot program last month. This program allows us to leverage the experience of our stakeholders, working in partnership with state, local, and tribal governments. This program will likely evaluate concepts like night operations, flights over people, flights beyond the pilot's visual line of sight, package delivery, detect and avoid technologies, and data links between pilot and aircraft. It will identify ways to balance local and national interests, improve communications with state, local, and tribal jurisdictions, and accelerate the approval of operations that now require special authorizations. Industry and stakeholder engagement remains the backbone for integration. Our UAS industry partners have demonstrated extended and beyond line of sight operations to support upcoming rulemaking. We also chartered a drone advisory committee to help prioritize integration activities. Furthermore, we formed the Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team with industry to identify risks and develop mitigation strategies. Now, there is still much to do. Congress can support these efforts by ensuring that all UAS operators abide by the same requirements and certification standards that we apply to all aircraft that operate in the airspace. To that end, remote identification and tracking will be a key component to full integration, such as operations beyond visual line of sight and operations over people. We deeply appreciate the National Defense Authorization Act that Congress passed 2 weeks ago that reinstates the registration rules for all small unmanned aircraft. All of us involved in integrating unmanned aircraft into our nation's airspace are helping write a new chapter in aviation history. I believe we will recognize the full economic promise and technological advances unmanned aircraft represent. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your statement. So, was wondering if you could share with us your vision or priorities for the top several steps to be taken for integration of UAS into domestic airspace. And for me, very importantly, what additional role can be played at the Tech Center utilizing their expertise and their ability to go, I think, way beyond what they've been asked to do already.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I agree that the Tech Center is going to be vitally important to the efforts that we have going forward. They've already contributed to much of the work that we've done in 2206 with detection at airports. They've interacted with the COEs, and we've gotten a lot of good work and data and analysis from the Tech Center. The key to this endeavor is that collaboration has been the #1 most important thing, because this is an emerging industry, so we need, as you heard, phenomenal brains and experts on the industry side. We have to coordinate and collaborate with local communities and municipalities. And of course, one of the bigger challenges, frankly, is to coordinate our activities and our incremental approach to regulating this emerging industry with our government partners. And there's quite a few interests across government in this endeavor. So the idea is to do it incrementally. The idea is to use a soft touch where we can use a soft touch, but a firmer touch where it's needed. And we're currently in the process of finding out where that line is and how to make that demarcation.
Thank you. And I would ask you to continue to look at a better utilization of the expertise that we have at our fingertips at the Tech Center, which, as I think you know, I believe have an ability to go beyond where they've gone, and would welcome the challenge of working closer on this.
Can you yield me the rest of your time?
Sure.
Just a quick question. I think I previewed what I was going to ask. Would you yield?
I would think about it, yes. Yes.
That's what happens when guys retire, or say they're going to retire.
Yeah.
They don't give a damn anymore about who they're. Gentleman yields?
Yes.
Thank you very much. The question, as I questioned last panel about remote identification, why can't we get that rule in place? Because it seems to me to be the simplest thing to do, to be able to start to be able to monitor safety, security, law enforcement, those things. So could you tell me what seems to be the holdup?
Of course, the whole issue of ID and tracking is a performance-based. We're not looking to identify a specific technology. We're looking for industry's input on what's available, and then what's available, will it scratch the itch? Will it get done what we need to have done in controlled airspace? I don't know the technical, scientific specifics of it, but my colleague Earl Lawrence, he was the designated federal officer for the ID and tracking ARC, and I'm sure he can give you more detail, sir.
So thank you very much.
Microphone.
Thank you very much. And to build on Mr. Elwell's comments, wanted to highlight.
Can you pull that mic a little closer to you?
Yes,
Got to pull the whole box.
Pull the whole box. There we go.
There you go.
A little better. Thank you very much. And to build on Mr. Elwell's comments, I wanted to highlight the Aviation Rulemaking Committee that we did host this summer. And I think it was a matter of priorities of which thing do we tackle first. And now that ID is at the top of our priority list, having the collaboration and the involvement of our partners, both public and particularly public safety, was a great benefit. And what we were looking for them to do is, one, identify what the wants and needs were at the local level. What do our public safety officers need in the field to assist them? We understand what we need from an air traffic standpoint, but we also needed to have a good understanding of all the various technologies that are available to us. As was highlighted in the panel previously, the technology is evolving so quickly. We wanted their assistance and their knowledge so that we were not identifying one particular solution, but getting their expertise and knowledge of how we could develop a performance-based standard. And now that we have their report, we'll be moving forward with our rulemaking activities.
So somebody should see something in short order then, in a matter of months?
Rulemaking is a very deliberative process, and
I know it is.
We'll take time to.
And that seems to be sometimes the problem. So I'll end it there. My time's expired. I don't want to cut into Mr. Larson's time, but I would say that you know, we've been dealing with the issue of distracted drivers, and the industry is coming forward saying, if you put this rule in place, it's not going to matter 6 months from now or a year from now. So why don't you work closely with the industry? And as our panel before said, put the rule in place, deploy the technology, deploy the rule, and then let's review it every 6 months, every year to tweak it, to change it to the technology. So again, I would encourage you to work as fast as you can on this, and it's something I'm very interested in. So I'd like to keep in touch with you as you move forward. Thank you very much.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elwell, yesterday was a deadline for the state, local, and tribal governments to register their interest in participating in the integration pilot programs. I understand. How many notices of intent did the FAA receive?
I don't know the exact number, sir, but it's hundreds. It's been we've been very happy with the response.
Mm-hmm. At some point, would the list of applicants be made public? How are you approaching that?
So I'm not sure, because it's an acquisition process that ends up with a MOU with the participants. I'm not quite sure how much of the information can be made public, but we'll get back to you on that.
Can you do that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Earlier this year, it was reported the Joint Advisory Committee had been divided with regards to determining proper roles of different levels of government and regulating UAS operations. What's the current status of the DAC's work? Did you tell them to go back to the drawing board? Did you say thank you very much? Where are we at with that?
So I think you're referencing task group 1 was the task group that was charged with that question. And that was before my time. In looking at it as I took over, I felt it was quite a bit to ask of that committee, quite frankly. And they briefed out at our last meeting in Seattle, and what we informed them is that with the advent of the integration pilot program, we're going to retask that group to, as Dr. Alonso suggested, and I agree wholeheartedly, is that we need to retask task group 1 to be more narrow and more specific on the data we need to collect and the data we maybe don't need to collect, and how we can use the data going forward. And that's data across everything that we're going to do with the IPP.
Yeah. Getting back to Dr. Alonso's answer to my question on data sharing, we have any limitations on sharing data from different states, different interest groups as we move forward on the UAS pilot program?
I I think that our only limitation is what the participants are willing to provide.
Okay.
Of course, our hope is that it'll be much like we've done with legacy aviation and CAST, SIAS, is to get agreements with all providers so that, as Dr. Alonso said, we have a constant flow of data and information that helps us understand the technology so we can better regulate it.
Yeah, I just know that this is one of the hurdles we had when we set up the 6 or so test sites in the 012 bill, I think, or whenever we last did it. But that one of the limitations that resulted in the test sites not being fully utilized was the issue of proprietary information and how it's being shared. So, you know, that if that hurdle still exists, we're still going to have the same problem. If there's a way to reach that hurdle, get over that hurdle, then actually, if you find a solution, let us know on that.
Thank you. I agree. It is a hurdle, and we do need to get beyond it.
Earlier this year, the administration said they were, you know, they have a two-for-one executive order on eliminating regulations before adding regulations. As you're moving through this particular exercise on UAS, are you running into any of these two-for-one problems?
No. What we are trying to do is have a discussion intergovernmentally how we're going to treat emerging technologies, because of course there's not a lot of regulation in existence. So within the confines of UAS or another commercial space, for instance, where would you do the two-for-one, or do we want to do two-for-one for something that could be so economically beneficial to the country?
Yeah, great. That's all I had, Mr. Lawrence. Do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, yes.
I would add, we do have at DOT a regulatory task force which is looking at this very issue and meets regularly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California, Mr. Lamoth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies to the committee and panelists for my not being able to be present earlier. We had Natural Resources Committee hearing also at the same time on NEPA and possible reforms of that, which kind of dovetails with part of my conversation on the unmanned aircraft, drones, et cetera. My district in the western states have a lot of forestry and then a lot of remote areas, and so the unmanned aircraft and drones would be very, very useful for a lot of aspects for inspection of infrastructure. I'm also working on a bill, bipartisan bill with Mr. Schrader from Oregon on easing up the process to remove hazardous trees that would be around power lines on federal lands. So that should be pretty obvious. If you got a dying tree or a hazardous tree that could fall against the power line, you get two bad things: blackouts to the city area that where the line's generally going to, and blackened skies from the forest fire is probably going to happen in the immediate area. So we believe that, especially given some of the rugged terrain you're dealing with, where transmission lines are going many miles across forested and other, remote areas, that this is a very important tool for the inspection of those, very cost-effective and environmentally correct and all that. So with what we're looking at, does Mr. Elwell, do you see that well, just a brief answer, is that a pretty important aspect of what you're trying to promote in your policy, of course? Okay. And then what we're also seeing is that everybody wants to jump in on the regulation of these aircraft. So, and I'm a little torn on this because, of course, I would like to have local jurisdictions have strong input and the ability to have things tailored to what they need. I have, the Oroville Dam is right in my backyard of my district as well, so there was a great amount of interest in what was going on with the dam, with the broken spillway, and the several months worth of infrastructure repair to that, and they've been very successful at that. But, a lot of aircraft work needed to be done with helicopters, and so you just don't always want drones running around the middle of that or in, forest fire areas or other emergency situations. So what's the balance do you see with local jurisdictions where states or counties or cities having their own drone, and if this is a redundant question, my apologies for not being here earlier, but having their own jurisdictions are setting up on that, their own rules versus the map of the U.S., the airspace doesn't really care about county lines, state lines, et cetera. What's the best course on that for the right type of regulation, and what can local input have on that to dovetail well with a countrywide regulation?
Well, sir, that's a great question, and that's what we started talking about earlier with the Drone Advisory Committee Task Group 1's efforts to look at that issue. But the integration pilot program that we started and the early applications just ended, that's the nut we're trying to crack. We want to let local communities, states, tribal authorities do time, use, and manner restrictions, present to us the time, use, and manner restrictions that they would like to impose executing their application or their pilot project. And as long as it doesn't interfere with the FAA's responsibility to keep the navigable airspace safe, then we ought to be able to do it, and we ought to gather a lot of data and a lot of information going forward. I mean, that's the whole purpose, really, of the pilot project, in addition to, of course, enabling this technology to grow. We need to find that sweet spot, I think was what somebody said about it in the first panel. We need to find that sweet spot.
Yeah, it can't be easy with the type of uses I was speaking of in infrastructure in rural areas, but then you have a complete opposite where there's movement to have packages delivered home to home in neighborhoods like that, which I guess would be pretty amazing, but also concerns as well. Does that come down to privacy issues with delivering to the wrong neighbor, and what does that all feel like with the other stories you hear about privacy invasion by these things with cameras? How would you, in my remaining time, touch that side of it?
So that's an interesting concept that you're talking about, dense airspace versus rural airspace, and they each present unique problems. And the airspace you were talking about in your district is Class G airspace, so it's uncontrolled. But as a result, we don't always know what aircraft are in G airspace at any given time. It might actually be easier to do certain drone testing in the complex airspace, because only aircraft that are identified and being tracked and monitored by air traffic control are in that airspace. So in a way, it's almost easier to allow that and permit that and to get data from that scenario. But they each have their own, their own unique challenges, and we're hoping that the applications for the pilot project, that we get plenty from both regimes so that we can gather data.
All right, let us know how we can help. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you. I think everyone can agree that there are certain places that drones can't fly. So when we were doing the 2016 FAA extension, Section 2209 envisioned a process by which operators of critical infrastructure facilities could seek approval to create no-fly zones for safety and security reasons. But the process, unfortunately, envisioned by 2209 remains unresolved. I know Mr. Davis had brought this up in the during the first panel, and I've worked across the aisle with members of this committee, including Representative Sanford, to improve the language and create a system that works for the FAA, for UAS operators, and for critical infrastructure stakeholders. It doesn't require facilities to apply for a designation, and it doesn't ask them to disclose any information about the facility that would compromise security. All it would do is make public the geographic location and boundaries of a critical infrastructure airspace designation. I think it's only fair that stakeholders have the opportunity to comment on possible changes to the airspace. It will only work if these designations reside in a central repository so that operators know where to look to find out where they can and can't fly. So, Mr. Elwell, what role, if any, does the FAA see for Section 2209 authorities under the new UAS integration pilot program?
So, 2209, we've been working diligently on 2209 within the constructs of our own authority, the authority that we have today. and 99.7, I think it is. And as a result, mostly working with DoD, we have over 900 of these sensitive facilities that we have restricted drone use. To your point, they've created these spaces where drones can't go. We do have some limitations on our authority to draw those lines. We have a couple of security locations that we have collaborated with Department of Interior, right? I'm gonna let Earl take over the details on this, but we're conscious of it, and we're with you. We want to have a database of these places that we want to have a sort of no drone activity, and we're working on it. And Earl?
Yes, so to build a little bit more on Mr. Elwell's comments, we've been working with the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Interior to designate additional areas as restricted areas for drone use at low altitude. In addition to that, we've been working with DHS and meeting with their stakeholder groups to get the feedback from their infrastructure stakeholder folks that they put together after 9/11 to understand what their needs are and how we might categorize what facilities would need protection of these particular no drone zones. One of the things that we're looking at is education as well. Not only education of the users and asking people to stay away from these facilities, but it's also a matter of education that in many cases, most of these facilities are already in restricted airspace where these operations are not supposed to be occurring as they are today. So we're looking at their other opportunities such as our ID and tracking methods so that we can identify the people who are already violating these, and then we can have additional counseling and education based on that.
All right, because this is very important that we do move forward on this, because I've received a lot of comments about the lack of clarity and really needing to move forward on this. In the remaining time I have, I just want to throw this question out there quickly. With the UAS integration pilot program, the issue of enforcement, how is that going to work with local? Is there going to be local enforcement? It really lies with enforcement. Really lies. The authority lies with the FAA. How is that possibly going to work? So, Mr. Elwell.
So as I was talking about earlier, finding that balance, and as we go forward in the pilot project and they get started, we need to balance the needs of the localities with our responsibility to operate safely and manage the navigable airspace. The pilot program is going to provide an opportunity for us to work with the local jurisdictions to understand their needs in managing their areas of responsibility, and of course public safety, privacy, trespass, those kinds of things within the low-level airspace that the applicant wants to use. And we'll work with those communities on setting the time, place, and manner restrictions to meet their needs and not disrupt the safe and efficient use of the airspace. And those restrictions that would be in the pilot program enacted by the local government by legislation or regulation would be monitored and enforced locally, and FAA would just continue to enforce any federal law.
I think this is going to be, as you allude to, difficult to do, so it's going to be something important that we keep, this committee keep oversight over that. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Napolitano.
Mr. Elwell, one of the questions I had at the prior panel dealt with FAA. Were there any restrictions for local entities to provide ordinances prohibiting the flying of drones in their space?
So as we've been discussing...
Can't hear you, sir.
As we've been
Just move it up closer.
Okay, sorry. As we've been discussing, the whole intent of the pilot project is to establish those lines of community involvement in their time, use, and manner restrictions that make sense for localities, many of which they have today and they use today. you know, we're in charge of the navigable airspace. So we're in charge of aircraft and taking off and landing. And of course, as Administrator Huerta has said many times, what drones in effect do is make every rooftop, every backyard, you know, every corner a potential airport, a potential takeoff and landing spot. So what we're going to do is we're going to work out where the local interests and the FAA's navigable airspace interests come together.
Excuse me, but in Southern California, that's going to be very hard because you have airports right in the middle of communities.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was explaining in the ports, there's beaches that are adjacent to the water ports. And so it's going to be hard to determine exactly where the line can be drawn.
Right. Yeah, and as I said, in the pilot project, we're hoping and looking for communities to present to us where locally.
Have you asked them yet?
Yes, that is
okay.
It's in the SIR and it's online and all of the requirements of the pilot project and what we're asking.
Okay, sir. The FAA was prepared to propose new regulations for unmanned aircraft operations over people in January, but pulled back the last minute due to national security concerns. Since then, there has been an informal hold on all UAS rulemakings. In the meantime, other countries are moving aggressively and ambitiously towards the regulations to attract investment in the technology. Have the law enforcement and national security communities communicated to FAA or to the industry? Or what will it take for the agency to lift the hold?
So we are on constant communication with our government colleagues in the national security area. In fact, I think, Earl, we had a number of representatives from law enforcement on the ID ARC discussing exactly—
Federal and local?
Federal, and we had local representation, talking about what they would need for that comfort level that they didn't have when we were getting ready to do the over people rule last year. So yes, we're in consultations and we're finding out what we need to do to give them comfort in
And how long will it take to process that to go into rulemaking?
That's a hard prediction to make because of the intergovernmental review process, but our hope is to get it done with efficiently and as quickly as possible.
Okay. The rulemaking on small UAS has made tremendous strides toward the safe integration of commercial drones into the national airspace. However, commercial drones cannot operate beyond the operator's visual line of sight or over people unless permitted by FAA, like commercial delivery. You have issued more than 1,000 waivers. Can you please explain what the criteria of FAA is?
So that question is the man who has done that 1,000 waivers.
All yours.
The best to answer that question, Earl.
All right, thank you, Mr. Elwell. Most of the criteria that we outline in the waivers that we try to be performance-based, and when we issued the final rule for Part 107, the small UAS rule, we included in its preamble information of what were the safety issues that an individual would have to address when they applied for a waiver. When we receive waiver applications, we look for that information because they need to address the safety of the operation that they are conducting. And obviously, every operation is different. An operation rural would have a different set of safety risks versus in a city. In addition, we worked very closely and collaboratively with our industry partners. I've personally conducted multiple webinars with AUVSI and educating applicants of this is the type of information that they should be bringing forward. We've updated our website where we provide instruction right on our website of here is the information that we need in order to obtain these waivers. Again, this is a new environment. We are learning as well as the operators, so we don't have the answers to everything for every circumstance. And because of that, it is a bit of a deliberative process as we work with the applicants to advance their operations. I'm happy to say night operations have become almost commonplace because it was clearly understood how to comply with that. We now have CNN operating over people, and they have shown how they could safely operate an aircraft over people. And we do have some beyond line of sight operations with our partners as well.
With the indulgence of the chair, I want to ask one more question, and that regarding personnel that is equipped or ready or trained. Do you work with the universities to attract people who have an interest in the technology?
In the STEM program, of course, has national interests way beyond DOT and FAA, but Secretary Chow just announced a few weeks ago a program called Forces to Flyers, where we're going to focus on working with educational entities to bring veterans who are coming off their service to our country and getting them into...
Well, that's for veterans. I'm talking about students who understand the technology and can help FAA upgrade their knowledge.
And I don't know, Earl, if we have an active recruitment process in that area.
So I'll just build a little bit on what Mr. Elwell said. Under the direction of this committee, we have our Center of Excellence, and part of the Center of Excellence, not only is it partnering with universities, it's also included a STEM program for education.
But is it directly addressing FAA and drones?
Yes, specifically FAA and drones. It's the drone, it is the Unmanned Aircraft Systems Center of Excellence, partnering with the universities who are doing a lot of our basic research. And part of that legislation included science, math and technology learning, and we do look for them. I like hiring from them as much as I can.
I'd like to know what the names of the universities are so we can share them with the rest of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Gentlelady yields back. With that reference to from Mr. Lawrence to the direction of the committee, I'll pick up from the committee. I'll pick up right there. I want to talk about Section 2210 for a moment. We've talked a lot about pilot projects and how quickly folks are getting ramped up on the President's request. We move forward there. I want to talk about the committee's request from July of 2016. We heard testimony from the previous panel from the Southern Company and a consortium of utility providers to say they had applied both for Part 107 waiver more than 12 months ago, as well as they are waiting on guidance from Section 2210 passed almost 18 months ago. You all have limited resources with which to do your work. You're having to work for the exact same goal for this consortium on two separate tracks right now. I'd be interested to know, number one, which track you expect to yield fruit first. Number two, what we can do as your partner here, partner in innovation, to keep you from having to go through the same process twice as this ever-changing dynamic continues to grow in speed. Mr. Elwell?
Thank you, sir. First of all, we absolutely appreciate the diligence of this committee and the work that you've done to help us in our efforts to assimilate this technology. I'll pass 2210 on to Earl. I will say, however, and I need to follow up with Billy. I think I'm aware of the application he's talking about, and if it's the one I think he's talking about, we actually denied that request about 4 months after it was made. So we'll follow up with him, and we'll make sure that we're all on the same page. Earl, 2010.
So thank you, and just to build on that on 2210, I'm happy to say we have two companies we are partnering with now on 2210. Specifically, they are Excel Energy. So it's a power line company that we have what we call a safety partnership with. And we've outlined a program with them to get them to be on line of sight operations, as well as BNSF has recently applied under that legislation as well. And I'm happy to say that we are working, and more recently, we received a request from the Southern Company to do a similar thing as those other two companies, and we have just started our discussions with them to add them into that program as well. So again, we don't have it all laid out, because it is new, and we're also understanding what 2210 offers us and what does that give us as far as additional authorities. But it does prioritize it. We take it very seriously, and infrastructure patrol is something very important, and we know it's your top on your list.
They help me to understand what that means, Mr. Lawrence. Two partnership companies, 18 months worth of legislation. I know if I go and look at a Part 107 waiver, the FAA will say, we're going to try to get you an answer back in 90 days. And to Mr. Elwell's point, no is actually an answer. And so that counts in that time frame. I make application under Section 2210. I'm also on a 90-day clock. I'm on a 120-day clock. What do I expect as an applicant?
So what we are doing with those companies was we actually sit down with representatives that across the FAA. So we have our aircraft certification folks, we have our flight standards folks, we have our air traffic organization, and we sit down with them face to face and we work out a schedule and say, okay, what do you want to do? They first tell us what their concept of operation, what aircraft are they using, what airspace are they going to be operating. They lay all that information out for us, and we identify the rules that are already in existence that they can comply with, and the additional rules that we may need to do a waiver or an exemption to. Identify those things, and then we go on and we do a joint schedule with them to identify what the time would be to achieve their objective. Because as we know, quite often they have to bring testing data, they have to bring design data and information to the discussion as well. And in some cases, we have to include the Air Force and other organizations because the airspace that they're operating in is joint use, and we need to bring in those other authorities to have this discussion.
So if you were to ballpark that for me, that doesn't sound like 90 days. About the third collaborative agency you had in there, I went ahead and ticked this up to 120, 180. What would you ballpark?
Yeah, yes, sir. So we meet immediately with them. And then we let them identify to us what the timeline, help identify what the timeline would be. If you're asking how long does it take, it depends on their project, but we are there physically meeting face to face, answering those questions at that point, not 6 months. We're not taking data and a letter and then coming back 6 months later. We're sitting down with them, answering those questions and identifying what needs to be done in order to do that operation safely.
Thinking about that collaborative process, tell me about the Drone Advisory Committee, Mr. Elwell. What is it that the FAA sees as the best way to utilize the expertise on the DAC?
So I'm still getting to know the committee. My first reaction is that one of the best things we're getting from the Drone Advisory Committee is the socialization of a unhomogeneous group of people. I mean, you've got brilliant technocrats who don't know a thing about aviation. You've got folks that are used to doing technological iterations in days, talking to regulators who we don't do change in days. So, so one of the best things about the DAC is the ability of those two communities to come together and really. We're learning from them and they're learning from us. We're learning ways that we can think faster, we can work faster. You know, our performance-based, risk-based regulatory philosophy now is much closer to how they look and do things and move out. So that's just sort of the philosophical side that the DAC is benefiting us. But they're also providing some, tremendous guidance. And we have people like Dr. Alonso on the DAC, and we have the heads of many of aviation's top trade associations. So it's a brain trust that is providing a great amount of information to us. So it's very, very valuable.
I'm glad to hear that very positive review of who we have there. What should we expect in terms of new taskings from the FAA, whether to RTCA or to DAC? What do you envision being requested of those folks going forward?
Well, as I said, we're developing a new tasking for Task Group 1 to align with the pilot project so that we can get their expertise in helping us gather data and implement the project. We're waiting in March. Task Group 3 is going to give us their recommendations on funding. Task Group 2 gave us some interesting recommendations. In fact, the one I mentioned earlier about we want FAA, Task Group 2 says FAA should go after operations in Class B airspace. That's that counterintuitive, really. That's the most dense airspace. But that makes sense because it's the most rigidly controlled airspace that we have. So going forward, it's hard to predict because it is such a dynamic and changing technological environment. But we promise to keep you guys absolutely informed on our work going forward.
When we're talking about funding, do you have the funding tools that you need as we sit here today to make that happen?
Yes, sir. Funding's not an issue.
Good to hear.
Well, we thank you both for being here, and thank you for what you are doing. As when Panel 1 suggests that we should revisit the regulatory environment every 180 days because things are moving so fast, clearly you have your work cut out for you in staying that nimble. I look forward to our next meeting, Mr. Elwell, where you tell me again about the folks you work with who expect change in 3 days, and about how we as regulators are now catching up to them in that model. With that, this hearing stands adjourned.